Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to John Polkinghorne, who has been in this university for many years. John, I always start by asking when and where you were born.
I was born on October the 16th, 1930 in Weston-super-Mare, but I actually come from a Cornish family, and my family had got as far east as Somerset at the time I appeared on the scene. My father I had 9 brothers and a sister, a large Cornish family, and my Cornish grandfather was a stonemason and had a pig and a cow to feed the family. My father, the village schoolmaster, thought my father was the cleverest boy he'd ever taught. But that father couldn't go to a grammar school in Bodmin. It was too far away and they couldn't afford the rail fare. So he left school at 14 and had actually a good career in the post office, where he came ahead postmaster and so on. And we got to Weston by the time I appeared on the scene. When I was 5, we moved from Weston to Street, a large manufacturing village in Somerset, very much the firm town of the Clark family, a very benevolent family in relation to the local community. And my father was the local postmaster there. And we lived there until I was 14. And I'm going
to slow you down. You're
I'm sorry.
whizzing through your life too quickly for me.
Yes.
Several things. One is Polkinghorne. That's such a lovely Dickensian name, is there?
Well, people sometimes say to me, "You're the solicitor in Bleak House," but that's Polkinghorne, as I'm sure you know. It is a Cornish name. Cornish names tend to begin with tree, pol, or pen. Pol means a hollow, and Polkinghorne means chief of the iron pit.
Really?
And it's not an uncommon Cornish name, but it's very uncommon outside Cornwall. And though I myself was born in Somerset, I think of myself as being Cornish, part of the Celtic fringe. That's partly romance, but I think it also has a certain sort of family seed in it as well.
Okay. Now, let's go back to a little more on your is there anything, about your grandparents? Did you know any of them personally?
Well, sadly, I didn't know my Cornish grandparents. My Cornish grandmother was a very dominant woman, and she quarrelled with all her daughters-in-law. My elder brother Peter was 18 months old, and they were visiting them. And this must have been the culmination of some long, tense family episodes. My grandmother apparently said, "Dorry," to my mother, "Dorry, that child shall not have salt with its egg." And my father, who was an extremely mild man, stood up and said, "Mother, I see that you and Dorry aren't going to get on. We're leaving today." And then my father went back to visit his parents. We never went back there as a family. And it's a real sadness to me that I didn't know my Cornish grandparents. My mother's mother and father, I knew very well. Their family name was Charlton, which is my middle name. And my maternal grandfather was a head groom. He was very skillful with horses. He trained and rode hunters in shows for his employers, and won prizes at the White City and things like that. And was one of the most fulfilled men I've known, actually. I mean, he really enjoyed the job. He was respected by his employees. It was a deferential role, but not a demeaning role. And so there's quite a contrast between the two families, because my Cornish forebears were sort of very independent-minded, small tradesmen, I suppose you would call them, people. But my grandfather and my grandmother had been a lady's maid, so they were in service. And we saw a lot of them. And eventually my grandfather came to live with us for a few years before he died. And I was very fond of him.
And then moving down the next generation, your mother, tell us something about your mother.
Well, my mother was in a way a remarkable woman. Looking back on it, I see she wasn't the easiest of mothers to have. She was rather directive in various ways. And she would say things like, "I'm as good as a witch. I knew you were worried about something," and so on, and it make you feel a little bit quivery. She was, however, she was the sort of person to whom people told things. If she weren't on a train, or the neighbours, they would tell her life story, and it seems to me, looking back on it, that on the whole she made pretty sensible responses, and more accepting responses very often than she would have done to members of her own family. She was very fond of literature. She kindled in me a love of Dickens and authors of that kind. My father was a much quieter, rather like his father, I imagine. Certainly a quieter, gentler sort of man. He'd been in the First World War, and never spoke about that really. And so he was a less obvious influence in the family. Both of my parents were religious people. We were a devout family. We went regularly to church.
Anglicans? Anglicans?
Anglicans, yes. Yes. And in Street we went, of course, to the local parish church. And perhaps the whole time we were there, certainly most of the time, there was a vicar, a chap called Richard Daunton Fear, who was a very good preacher. I remember having no difficulty in listening to him, even as a young child. I was very well behaved as a young boy, but he could make Bible stories come alive and things like that. So it was a sort of pleasure to go to church. My parents never spoke much to me about religion directly. They were too reserved, I think, about it for that. But you absorb things through the port. It was clear that religion was important to them. And looking back on it, I can't really see a time when I wasn't, in some sense, part of the worshipping and believing community of the church. I mean, I see myself as being a cradle Christian in that sort of way.
Cradle Christians, we've come on to religion earlier, as we sometimes do, but it's not perhaps so surprising. I was a cradle Christian too, in the sense that my uncles certainly were very devout, and my mother interested in a philosophical way. But I had a great rebellion against it in my teens, late teens. Did that not happen to you?
No, it didn't. I didn't have a rebellion in that sense. I suppose the nearest I got to it, of course, I did national service. I did rather short national service. I was only in the army for 14 months because of the vagaries of the period of national service. I went in 48 and came out in September 49 in time to come up to Cambridge. And I mean, nothing very dramatic happened, but I began to use the sort of language that people use in barrack rooms in the army, which is very different from the language we used at home. And I was a sergeant instructor in the Royal Education Corps, and I used to get a little bit drunk at mess nights and things like that. Nothing very remarkable. I didn't give up my religious practice. I was a communicant during that sort of time. But I felt things were getting a bit sort of ropey, I suppose one might say. So when I came up to Cambridge, I was contacted by and taken to the Christian Union Freshers Service in Holy Trinity, beginning of Michaelmas term in 1949. And the preacher was somebody called L.F.E. Wilkinson, I know very clearly. And he preached about Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus on the road through Jericho. And he pointed out that if Zacchaeus hadn't responded to Jesus then, since Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem to his final encounter with the authorities, he would have lost his chance, and he urged us to not lose our chance to give it our lives to Christ, and called for people to come forward, as people did in those days. And a lot of people did come forward, of whom I was one. And at the time, I would have said that was my conversion. I would have seen that as the beginning of the real thing, so to speak. Looking back on it now, I don't see it that way. I see it as an important staging point in my spiritual life, my Christian pilgrimage. But I don't see it as being the initiation of it. I see it as a further step. But I was very much caught up with the Christian Union the whole of my undergraduate days, which I feel both to some extent grateful and to probably a greater extent regretful, I have to say. It was a rather narrow world. It was a world, I think, that had a good deal of sort of fear of enjoyment, or fear indeed of other forms of Christian belief and so on. It was very narrow and confining in that sort of way. And I learned some things from it. I mean, I do think I found a deeper personal commitment to the cause of Christ, and I came to value Scripture, not quite in the rather uncritical way that was encouraged in the Christian Union in those days, but I came to do that, and that has remained with me lifelong. Scripture has always been important to me. not as a textbook, but as a sort of laboratory notebook of the spiritual life, if you like. And so I've something to be grateful for. But as I became a graduate student, as I grew a bit older and more mature, I moved away from that, and would no longer sort of see myself as a sign that
was this kick you?
It does kick
Kick
you.
you.
Yes.
I was a member of OIQ at one point.
Yeah, yes.
Oxford.
Much the same, actually.
Much the same. Well, I'm sure we'll come back to this later on.
Yeah.
Just to finish with your parents, well, did you have any siblings?
Yes, I did. I had a brother, Peter, who was 9 years older than me. Quite different from me, a much more outgoing sort of person. He was a good pianist, for example, and things of that nature, which I don't have those gifts. He was all right at school, but not academically brilliant. I was clever little boy. As you grow older, you always have some fascinating-looking girlfriends in tow, and so on. He went to the RAF, trained as a pilot, and was killed in the RAF during the war. He was in Coastal Command, and it's a mysterious event that we've never been able to sort out the details of. They went out one night. They were flying Liberators over the Atlantic. They went out one night, and it was a very stormy night, and almost certainly they were killed by the weather rather than by the enemy. But they went out for some special purpose, and we've never been able to find out what the purpose was. So that was, of course, a sad thing. I was 12 at the time, and of course I was very upset at the time. But then I recovered in the way that 12-year-old children do. And then later in life, I of course became much more regretful again that I didn't have a brother. And my parents, in between me and Peter, had a daughter, Anne, who had some sort of intestinal problem when she was 6 months old and died under surgery. So my parents had a sad life. They lost 2 of their children. I was the remaining one. And actually they were good about that. They didn't, as I recollect it, they didn't emphasise to me that all my hopes were now concentrated on me, because I knew that must be so. And when I had an academic career, went to university and everything, I was certainly glad, and they were glad, quite clearly, though again they didn't say this very directly, were glad that I was fulfilling something that my father might have, almost certainly would have done, if his educational opportunities had been different.
Because he was so bright.
Because he was so bright.
Was he good at mathematics?
Well, he was certainly good at mathematics. I think probably he would have. I suspect that if there's genetic elements in these things, and I'm sure there is, that I get that from my father. Yes.
That's an interesting remark. Do you think that mathematics is genetically transmitted?
Well, I think there's a degree of it. Yes, I think so. I have a grandson who's reading mathematics and Trinity at the moment, so you can see these things. Of course, there's the cultural aspect to it as well, with all these things. But I mean, mathematics is a funny sort of subject, because either you can do it or you can't. And some people just can't do it at all. And very, very clever, intelligent people just don't have that way of thinking.
There's also something, I always used to think it was something you could do or you couldn't do, and you knew that like Peter Swinnerton Dyer told me that at the age of 2 or 3, in the bath, his mother used to set him problems to keep him quiet. But when I interviewed his current successor, so to speak, John Coates,
oh yes,
he really didn't show any real particular aptitude until his early 20s. I mean,
really, that's very interesting.
I mean, he wasn't bad at it, but there's no sign of brilliance.
Yes. That's very unusual, I think. I mean, mathematics is a fairly defined gift, and people tend to show it quite early. I was a clever little boy at sums. I tell you a little bit about my early schooling.
Tell me.
There was, of course, a primary school in the street, and it had actually modern buildings. And I went to there, and from the start, I was terrifically good at sums. You were supposed to do sums by counting shells and that sort of thing. I scorned all that. I just wrote down the answers. But I was very slow in learning to read. And my mother got worried about that. And she had a friend, whose name was Mrs. Macfarlane, who was a Froebel-trained mistress, a teacher, I mean, who was teaching her own son about my sort of age at home. And Mother got me taught by Mrs. Macfarlane. And within a very short time, I've mastered reading and became a voracious reader. And that was helpful to me. I'll sometimes speculate what might have happened if I staggered on at Tyne-Teys, as the school was called. Then that was for a couple of years, and then the Clark family, all the Clarks lived around the street. They were very good in that way. They didn't go off and buy villas on the south of France or country houses in Ireland. And they stayed around, and they had families, of course, and they ran a little school, essentially for their own children, but a few selected local children allowed to come along as well. It was called the Meeting House School. It was next door to the Quaker Meeting House. And I went to that. And it was a very small school. It must have been about sort of 15 or 16 children in it at any one time. A single teacher, Miss Theobald. And it was a very good teacher, and enjoyed it. I enjoyed being taught by her, and again I learned a lot there. I mean, she was obviously teaching different ages, but somehow she seemed to manage all that. And so that's where I went. And at that school I had what I now see as being a very important experience. If you did good work, you used to get a gold star, and it would put up against your name. And I used to get lots and lots of gold stars. It was a great sort of firmament of stars, I want to think. And then one day, Miss Theobald said, I'm going to do something different today. I'm going to do a musical test with you. I'm going to play a series of pairs of notes on the piano, and you ought to tell me whether the second note is higher or lower than the first note. So I listened to all that, wrote down the answers, handed them in, expecting another gold star. Most of them were wrong. I don't have a very good ear for music. I've got a little bit better since those days. I usually can tell whether it's higher or lower now, but I couldn't then. And it was, of course, an important and indeed inevitable experience that you couldn't do everything. And I was she was very nice, sweet sort of person. She didn't make you feel foolish for having made a muff of things. But it was, looking back at it, it was a formative experience in my life.
Was that because you really couldn't tell whether it was higher or lower? Or?
Yeah, I can't quite recapture it really. I still have hesitations about that. I've learnt now. Of course, if you're a clergyman, you have to wrestle with having to cope with a certain amount.
Exactly.
And I fortunately had a musical wife, so that helped me a lot. But now I occasionally test myself, and I know I have to let my intuition tell me the answer. It's fatal to start thinking about it, and I get all quivery about it. And now I'm more often right than wrong. But at that time, I presumably thought then I could do it just intuitively, but obviously I couldn't.
Well, we've come on to music, which is a subject which I particularly like talking to mathematicians about, because
yes.
One of the founders of my discipline, or great figures, said there are three true vocations: music, mathematics, and anthropology. This was Levi Strauss. But I've always thought music and mathematics might be well connected. Has music meant a lot to you?
Well, it has meant a lot to me, but I'm musically very uninstructed. I never learned to play anything. That in itself surprises me. My mother played the piano a bit, and she encouraged my brother to, and so he became quite a good pianist. I think that was probably because my parents recognised early on that I was going to be academically clever, and they didn't want anything to distract from that. So, musical lessons might have been not the best use of time or something like that. So I regret that, but I don't think I'd have been any particular good at it. But music's important to me. I like listening to music. I especially like contrapuntal music. I mean, that's, I suppose, goes with the mathematics, it's the patterns and all that sort of thing. Bach is far and away my favourite composer, and I listen to music quite a bit. And my wife, who we'll get on to obviously in due course, was a musical person, and I'll tell you a bit more about her when the time comes. But she helped me too in that respect.
Some people work to music, or listen to music and are inspired and then work? Do you?
No, I can't do that. I mean, I dislike. If I'm going to listen to music, I have to listen to it. I don't want it as background. It's disrespectful to music, and it's distracting to me. So I absolutely never work to music. If I'm going to listen to music, I sit down and listen to it.
I interviewed a long-time friend of mine who's a mathematician at King's, Ken Moody, and he listens very carefully to music when he has a special room where there's nothing except the music, and he listens. So that seems to be. Whereas I often find when I really want to write something very difficult, I listen to my favourite music before.
Right. I see. That's interesting.
And it helps inspire me a bit.
When I want to write something particularly special, first of all, I must write it in the morning. I'm a morning person. I decay as the day goes on. And I must then I must have absolute freedom from distraction. I have to concentrate on what I'm doing.
Where do you write?
In my study. Well, yes, I've always written in my study company or my office in the department in those sorts of days.
Not at home.
Well, it is at home. Now it's at home.
Yeah,
because I've retired and Queen's doesn't give retired fellows rooms in college, so I work at home. But I have a room in the house which is a sort of study library, which is wholly devoted to that.
With a telephone and email?
Well, there is a telephone. There is a telephone there. But I don't get all that many telephone calls. I mean, of course, sometimes you get interrupted, but not very often. I don't use email, much to the irritation of many of my friends. And the reason for it is quite simple. If you write books about science and religion, you get a certain amount of unsolicited correspondence.
I bet you do.
And I'm very conscientious about correspondence. The first time somebody writes to me, even if they write me a rather crazy letter, I always write back. If it's only to say thank you for your thoughts about the Great Pyramid or whatever it might be. I would say in passing that one of the parables that absolutely fascinates me is the sheep and goats. And the thing about the sheep and goats is that neither of them knew who they were dealing with. Lord, when do we see you in prison? And so on. Visit you or not visit you. And I think that when I appear before the Lord, he's going to say to me, I wrote you a crazy letter in green ink and you sent me a reply. That's going to be my ticket. So I don't have email. I actually do have an email address, but I don't allow people to know it, and I've chosen an address which is unguessable by anybody else, only my family know it.
I hope it will remain so. Well, you can always change it. So that was a little bit. Just on writing, because that interests me. You've written many books. How do you write? I mean, do you write longhand? Do you write with a computer?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me say I love writing. It's one of my favourite occupations. Initially, if it's serious writing, and certainly if it's a book, for example, I have to write longhand. If the thought is flowing, I just can't type fast enough to keep up with it. So I write it longhand, biro on A4 paper, and of course you can cross out and everything like that, which is helpful. When I've done that, I have to type it up. Of course, in days gone by, I used to have a secretary who would do that for me. Now I have to type it up myself on a PC, and I don't regret that at all. I don't naturally write good syntax, and the close attention to the text that you get from typing it up enables me at least to correct some of the mistakes in that sort of way. And if I'm writing a serious article or I'm writing a book, and I have time for it, and I'm very well organised about deadlines, so I nearly always do have time, I will set it aside for at least a couple of months and look at it again afterwards, because when you've just written something, you do tend, at least I tend, to think, gosh, that was really rather good. You look at it again in 2 months' time, you see, that wasn't really quite well expressed, and maybe that argument isn't quite right. So I'm a revisionary writer, and of course, PC, very helpful in that respect. But I love writing for two reasons, really. One is I write to find out what I think. You read things, you think about things. Ideas buzz around in your mind, maybe this, maybe that. If you have to put something on paper, you have to decide, what do I actually want to say about this? It crystallizes your thinking. John Robinson, of Honest to God fame and everything, who is a good friend of mine, once said to me, I can't write without a pen in my hand. And I knew exactly what he meant. You need that. And the other thing I like about writing is that nobody tells you what to do. You're in charge. You're in charge. Most of life, you have little compromises, a little give and take, and that sort of thing. But when you're writing, you're in charge. I like that.
That's very nice. Yeats, the poet, said that someone asked him where his poetry was, and he said, in the tip of my pen.
Yes.
But I like the second, that you're in charge. I mean, sometimes when being urged to be collaborative in our work and to work with other people and so on, And that's nice in many activities in science and so on, but the actual creative act is not very easy to share.
No, it doesn't. The first book I ever wrote, or had hand in writing, I have to say, was a monograph that we wrote here in Cambridge called The Animal Gas Matrix. And four of us wrote it together. We had all worked together for many years. It was on a subject we were all pretty expert on. And it nearly destroyed our friendship. We each wrote a chapter and then shuffled around and rewrote the chapters on. But the arguments about do we put this in, how do we express that sort of thing, I mean, it's so irritating. Everybody is convinced they knew the right way to do it. After that, I have actually once or twice written books with other people, but basically never again.
Yes, I'm told that editing a volume of your friend's work is also a recipe for disaster sometimes.
Well, yes, of course, because you can't win it. I have edited some multi-author volumes, and you can't win with that because you accept what people tell you. Of course, that's natural. If you don't accept it, you make an enemy for life. I mean, it's a highly enjoyable thing.
Yeah. Right, well, let's just finally on your childhood.
Yes.
Were there things outside? Your parents were careful to shelter you from diversions from your academic life, but you must have had hobbies and interests. Were you keen on games, or did you play games?
Well, in principle, I would like to have been good at games, but in practice, I wasn't, and so I didn't do much games playing other than team games at school, and a little later on in life playing tennis or squash with people who were as bad as I was, which was necessary. There was a certain amount of walking in the countryside in Somerset. I mean, we lived in a nice county in that respect. Did a lot of reading. I was a very, very voracious reader. And there was an excellent library in the street which the Clark family had endowed, and I would go every week to change my books and get some new books to read. I did a lot of reading. I was not a very enterprising child. I have to say. Because also it was wartime and things were a little bit restricted, perhaps that you could do. But my father and I used to go for cycle rides in the country and things like that. But I had a pretty quiet life, I think it would be fair to say. I mean, looking back at it, I think I rather regret that I didn't. I'm not sure what I would have done, but I wish I had a wider portfolio of recreational activity.
I mean, you were just a little early for the kind of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien era of Charles Williams era, but
yes, I was.
But
yes.
were you interested in that kind of Arthurian magical
Well,
world?
not particularly. I think I do remember at the Quaker school, the Meeting House school, we used to do sort of handicrafts in the afternoon, mostly knitting. I'm a terrific knitter, a plain knitter. And Miss Theobald would read a story to us. I remember reading a story and I was absolutely entranced with it. And I thought it wonderful. It went on day after day. And I realise now that it was The Hobbit.
Really?
Yeah, yes, which we were being read. And so that was my only the sort of books I tended to read, either just William books or things like that, or Percy F. Westerman, who wrote these sort of daring do type of things. Then I would mildly precociously read Dickens from time to time, under my mother's encouragement, but not forced. I mean, once she put the book in front of me, so to speak, I'm drawn into it and happy to read it.
Then after that school, you went on to the Perse, is that right?
Well, not quite. I left the Quaker school when I was 10 or 11 and went to Elmhurst, which was a little local grammar school in the street, with a pretty remarkable staff, really. I mean, it was a small school and so on, but there was in particular, there was a wonderful English teacher called Miss Pugh, and we used to
P-E-W or
P-D-U-G-H.
Yeah.
And we used to read plays, Sheridan and Shakespeare, of course, and things like that in class, and that enlarged my range. I mean, I began to engage with the drama, though it was a long time before I ever saw a play on the stage. We used to go and occasionally see the pantomime at the Bristol Hippodrome, but I hadn't seen a stage play, I think, probably until I was an undergraduate, and I'm not quite certain about that. But then, at the age of 14, my father became the head postmaster of Ely, and we moved to Ely, and after some investigation, he was advised that it would be worth a rather tedious train journey into Cambridge every day for me to go to the post. And I'm glad I did that. And I had...
You had a local school, didn't you? Was King's College Ely?
Well, King's School was there in Ely, but it wasn't thought much of in those days. I mean, it had a great renaissance, I suppose, 30 years ago or something like that. It was rather just ticking over there. If I'd gone to school in that neighbourhood, I would have gone to Surham Grammar School. And there's a lot of amusing story about that, because my father, first of all, went to see the headmaster of Surham Grammar School, and he brought with him a letter from my headmaster at Elmhurst in Street, which the headmaster read and said, "Your boy is obviously a clever boy. I think he should go to the first school in Cambridge where they have clever contemporaries." So I went there, and within a term of my going there, the headmaster of Surham turned out as the new headmaster of the first.
Had he known, do you think?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It's perhaps rather self-flattering to think we had known. But it's possible. And I enjoyed the first a lot. It was tiresome being a train boy, but it was endurable. Even with those unreliable post-war steam trains.
So you were a day boy at the post?
Yeah. Well, most of the boys at school were day boys. Most of the boys lived in Cambridge. And the big thing that happened to me at the first was there was a chap called Mr. Seedham, Vic Seedham, who was the senior maths master there, and who was a really inspiring teacher.
How do you spell his name?
Sederman. And he was a really inspiring teacher, and he could see I was good at maths, and he encouraged me. And he used to give me, for example, work to do in the holidays, which I was glad to do. I mean, I enjoyed maths. I mean, maths is it's an entrancing subject if you're good at it. You sort of fall in love with it. It gives you a sense of power. You know, this week I can solve an equation I couldn't solve last week, that sort of thing. So I really love maths.
Which part of maths? I mean, do you mean arithmetic or do you mean geometry?
I don't mean arithmetic. I particularly mean calculus, I think, at that stage. Algebra too, of course, but calculus particularly, which is such a clever and powerful technique. And so that really launched me in that direction. And when I did higher certificate, I did double maths and physics, and so on. And
were there other clever boys? Do you remember any of them?
Yes, there were certainly some other clever boys. The most outstanding boy of my particular generation at first was Peter Hall.
Peter Hall?
Yeah, the theatrical producer.
Dramatist.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was obviously very, very gifted. I mean, he was a clever boy. He read English, of course, but he was clever at studies, though he didn't do too much academically. When he came around to graduate, he was very busy producing plays. But I mean, he's been the outstanding figure of our particular generation. And there were other sort of there were intelligent boys around. I mean, it was a stimulating crowd of people to be with.
There were no downsides. There was no bullying or negative aspect to
No,
school.
not really. No, I don't think that there was. I mean, there was perhaps a little bit more of that in Elmhurst than at the Perth, because being a clever boy in Elmhurst made you a little bit more unusual than the Perth. So the usual sort of things about SWATs and all that sort of thing. But nothing really bad at either school. I mean, nothing that ever made me feel, gosh, I hate the idea of going to school today or something like that.
You continued mainly concentrating on work. I mean, you didn't do drama or politics.
Not really. I did actually play the small role of Vincentio in The Taming of the Shrew. Peter Hall was Petruchio, of course. But I wouldn't say that. Of course, one of the things that was the main downside of life at the Perth. The Perth had a lot of extracurricular activities. But if you were a train boy, it was and you had to.
A train boy, you mean you had to catch the Ely train?
Yeah, yes, had to catch the Ely train. I mean, you obviously didn't have to catch a particular train, but you already had to spend half an hour, 3/4 of an hour travelling home. And if you were an hour and a half later, it's spelling out. So that tended to reduce the extracurricular activities. I didn't avail myself of those as much as I perhaps might have done if we lived in Cambridge.
Right. Well, I think that takes us on to Cambridge.
Not quite. I've got the army too.
The army. Yes.
Yes. Well, I went to the army in July 1948, they had a scheme by which you could go in, if you were going to go to university, you could go in early. I went in well before my 18th birthday. You could go in early, and with the idea at that time, national service only could be a year, so you'd come out in good time for university. They put it up while we were in, as I said a little bit earlier, they actually let those of us who come in on that scheme out just in time to get up to university. So I went to the army and did my basic training on Salisbury Plain with the Royal Hampshire Regiment. Exhausting, extraordinary. An interesting barrack room, because almost all the people in the barrack room were people who were going to university as soon as the army was over. And there were one or two people who had been to the university and were going to the army after it. So we were quite an unusual crowd of people. We had a very sort of proletarian, one might say, corporal in charge of the barrack room. And after we'd been there 3 or 4 days, he said to us, "Was you all muckers before you came in?" So we said, "We don't know what muckers means, but if you mean friends," no, we weren't. But we get on well because we were all aiming for the same thing. So I did my basic training. It was very exhausting, but certainly went up. And I discovered there an ability which I hadn't known I had. That I was a very good shot. Of course, we did shooting, and I was a really good shot. And the Royal Hampshires were keen on rifle shooting, and I became part of their team. Entered in the Young Soldiers' Cup in the British Army in 1948, and we won the cup. And I have a little bronze medal at home. It's by Private Polkinghorne on the back to prove it. So it's my one sporting triumph. I didn't carry on shooting when I came to university. It was again a little too wearisome perhaps to check out for the rifle range, but at least that was
You
something.
enjoyed shooting, obviously.
Well, yeah, well, because I could do it. Yes, I mean, I think you tend to enjoy things that you can do reasonably well. I had very good eyesight in those days. I think that's probably why I was good at it. And then I got transferred to the Royal Army Education Corps, and that was an interesting move because the educational qualification to go in the RAEC was that you had to have passed higher certificate. Now I had taken higher certificate because I hadn't got the results. And so when I was interviewed by the officer about this, I put it to him that being a Major Scholar of Trinity might be equivalent to having passed high school certificate, and he accepted that. But another chap in our crowd, his name actually is Brian Rees, and he eventually became the headmaster of rugby, was only a minor scholar in history at Trinity, and the army authorities decided that wasn't good enough. So Brian had to go into the service corps. So then we went down to Bodmin, actually my hometown, I suppose, home territory. My grandfather had helped to build Bodmin Jail, amongst other things. And we did a sort of 3 months training down there. The only formal teaching training I've ever had. And then we were posted to our various units. I was posted to an Army Basic Trade Centre just outside Malvern, where people trained for various crafts in the engineers or in the reaming. And my task was every fortnight to teach an introductory course in mathematics for those who were going to be electrical fitters. So I taught the same course every fortnight, which was a bit boring, but I had to do it. And of course, because it was essentially a training unit, you also had to do the regimental duties. You had to be an orderly sergeant and things like that, which was pretty difficult for me, I have to say, as a rather young 18-year-old, despite having 3 stripes on my arm, but one survived.
One of the odd things about quite a lot of the science interviews with people about your generation was the importance of either national service or the end of the war. People like Anthony Hewish and others who came back often with small bits of equipment which the army had kindly given them at the end of the war.
Well, Radio Astronomy is founded on army surplus, yes.
So one sees that Cambridge in the first or the second half of the 20th century was quite influenced by the trauma of the war and people going into it.
Yes, well, because I escaped the trauma of the war other than through the loss of my brother. And I always think that it's a very big division. between my sort of generation, which didn't know directly the experience of war, and those generations only a few years before us, who in one way or another had seen extraordinary things and sometimes done extraordinary things. And they've had experience which one can only half imagine, really.
You remind me, temperamentally, if I may say so, a bit of my uncle, Richard Rhodes James, who was in
yes, definitely.
who you may know of.
Yes.
And he was in the Gurkhas, and he fought in Malaya, not in Malaya, well he did perhaps, but in Burma.
Yeah.
And just that 3 or 4 years, he's 3 or 4 years older than you, he saw things which we haven't.
Yes, absolutely.
So, shall we come to Cambridge?
I think we might come to Cambridge. Yes, I came up to Trinity. And I was part of an exceptionally talented cohort of people in Trinity, because the vagaries of national service meant that 2 years of scholars were fused into one. So there were a lot of very good mathematicians around. And you certainly learn as much from your contemporaries as you do from the Dons. And so that was very stimulating.
Tell me who they were. Or
Well, my two closest friends, or three closest friends, one was Michael Attier, who later on became president of the Royal Society. And
I was going to interview him, but he says he'd been interviewed at length in detail. So.
I expect Michael has. We became very good friends, and he was my best man when I got married and so on. So he was around. And then James Mackay and somebody called John Aitchison, who joined us from Scottish universities after our first year. They were affiliated students. James eventually became Lord Chancellor, so he moved from mathematics into law. And John Aitchison became a statistician, was professor of statistics at Hong Kong University for many years. They were my three closest friends, all mathematicians actually. I mean, I had other friends you didn't know classics and historians and people like that, but my three closest friends were mathematicians. And there was another very distinguished mathematician in our year, who of course I knew, but was not so friendly with, Frank Adams.
Yes.
Who was sadly killed in a road accident, really quite young, but who was clearly an outstanding mathematician. So it was a good crowd to be around. I mean, they were. And
the teachers, I mean, Hardy was presumably dead.
Hardy was dead. Yes. Well, I was taught applied mathematics principally by Nick Kemmer, who was a very and who actually became my supervisor as a research student in my first year, but then moved over to Edinburgh. He'll recur in the story. He was an exceptionally nice man, and before the war he had made very important, as a young man, he made very important discoveries in theoretical particle physics, which is the subject I came to work in. And something happened to him during the war. He was a Russian who had spent his family life in Germany and come to this country in the second half of the 30s. Very English in character, in fact perfectly English in pronunciation. But somehow or other he lost his nerve about physics during the war. And though he was still very clever and very quick to pick things up, he really didn't try and do anything or really keep closely in touch with where the action was. So he was, everybody liked Nick, but he really wasn't wholly satisfactory. I was taught pure mathematics by Abraham Samoilovich Bezikovich, who was...
We'll get the spelling of that at some point.
Well, Bezikovich is Besicovitch. He was a very distinguished Russian pure mathematician who was an émigré and had been a fellow of Trinity for a long time. And he was an extraordinary teacher. You have problems to do for supervisions, and if you were fairly clever, in about 10 minutes or so, you've gone through the problem, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, gone through the problems, and probably you solved all of them satisfactorily. Then Bezikovich would produce some tatty piece of paper on which was written, apparently very simple looking, he taught analysis, mathematical analysis, apparently a very simple looking problem. And he said, solve this. And they were fiendishly difficult. And you sit there cudgeling your brains, and he would say, I am surprised that so good a mathematician as you cannot solve so simple a little problem. I never solved one of those problems on the spot. But of course you took it away, and you worked on it during the week, and with any luck, you'd bring back the solution the next week. It was a sort of painful experience, but extraordinary. The other thing I learned from him, the lectures on mathematical analysis were given by somebody called Robert Rankin, and he was one of these mathematicians who lecture in an extremely formal style, write the arguments up on the blackboard, speaking them with their back to the audience at the time they're writing them up. You copy them down, and that's it. And it's all set out in the formal techniques of analysis, given epsilon greater than 0, there exists, etc. And you see the power of the proofs, but it was hard sometimes to see a way through them. When you went to see him as a coach, he talked about a problem, he'd look at it and he'd say, is large, is small. In other words, you have to figure out the qualitative things before you start writing what is after all, in some sense, mere technique, to put that into formal language. So he was a great teacher. I remember him with great gratitude. But as I went through my undergraduate years, I got more and more interested. I've got more and more interested in the fact that you could use mathematics to understand the physical world. So I gravitated towards applied mathematics and away from pure mathematics. Possibly also because Michael Attier and Frank Adams were obviously cleverer than me, both going to be pure mathematicians. And so that's what I did. And they're a great influence, though and sometimes a rather remote one. My third year I did part 3 of the maths trials that one did in those days, and of course I did quantum theory, and the foundational course in quantum theory was taught by Paul Dirac, who had been one of the great figures of quantum theory, and he taught it, he was a wonderful man, he taught it absolutely without rhetoric, and absolutely without any reference to what he had personally himself discovered. There were quite a lot of things he was telling you about were his own discoveries. But he laid out the argument with a sort of majestic inevitability about it. It was just like the development of Bach fugue, really. One thing leads to the next, leads to the next, and that sort of thing. And it was an extraordinary experience, which is preserved in the book he wrote, the famous book he wrote, The Principles of Quantum Mechanics, which the lectures in the book are quite closely aligned. But Jack was a sort of scientific saint, really. I mean, he was very simple-minded in some sense, very narrow, concentrated on things. There are lots of Dirac stories which are all about how Dirac brought a rather direct and simple-minded interpretation of things. I mean, the quintessential Dirac story is Dirac gives a lecture about his latest ideas. Somebody says, Professor Dirac, I didn't quite understand how equation 5 followed from equation 4. Dirac says nothing. The chairman says to him, Professor Dirac, aren't you going to answer Dr. So-and-so's questions? Dirac says, that wasn't a question, it was a statement. And that sort of thing would be a put-down in anybody else's mouth. But in Dirac, it was that's just his style.
Oh, lovely. I'm hoping to get his radio. John Silston was mended Dirac's radio for me. He's going to give it to me as a souvenir.
Yes.
I'm a great fan of the little I know of Dirac, and your successor came to my room, that's Neil Turok, and wrote Dirac's equation on my blackboard for me.
Yes.
And he tried to explain why this equation, the famous equation, is so important.
Yeah, well, that's so beautiful.
Why? Can you have?
Well, it was the equation that put together special relativity and quantum theory for the first time successfully. People have been trying to do that, and they hadn't figured out how to do it. And Dirac found this extremely economic, elegant way of doing it. And it was such a beautiful equation. I feel sure he felt he hit the bullseye. But he immediately found that an unexpected consequence of his equation was that the electrical properties, electromagnetic properties of the electron are twice as strong as you would expect them to be, which was a known fact, but nobody had known why it was so. So it had that immediate bonus, and within a couple of years he also discovered that the equation implied the existence of antimatter, which was again was unknown beforehand. So it's a wonderful, wonderful equation, and it's actually engraved upon Dirac's memorial tablet in Westminster Abbey.
Is it?
What the tourist makes of it, I don't know. But
I'll have to go and have a look, because there's a short version of the equation apparently, and a longer one, I think.
Yes, that's right. Well, they've got the short version.
It also implied the existence of many of the elementary particles. Is that right?
No, not quite right. No, it was specifically for the electron, though you can use it for any spin or half particle. It didn't imply the existence of other particles in that sense. And Dirac's concern was very much with the foundational structure of quantum theory, conceptual structure of quantum theory, not very much with the nitty-gritty of how many elementary particles there are and that sort of thing. I mean, there's a famous Dirac story which Dirac is lecturing in, when would it be? Lecturing probably in the 1950s. And he refers to a recently discovered particle, the muon. The muon was discovered in the 1930s.
Time stood still.
Yeah.
Was the great generation of mathematicians in Trinity still remembered much when you were there? I mean, the Hardy, Ramanujan, and all those.
Well, of course, we all knew about that. Knew about them, yes. And of course, Littlewood was still around.
Littlewood, yes.
Being a friend. I didn't get Littlewood, of course, retired from teaching when I was an undergraduate. I got to know him, of course, when I became a fellow, and he would sometimes talk about the old days. But it was, yes. I don't think we recited, so to speak, the annals of the tribe in that sort of way. But we were aware that there had been great people around.
There were some famous economists and so on at that time too, weren't they?
Yes.
Successors of Keynes and people who edited Keynes's works. And
yes, and Straffer and so on.
Straffer, yes.
Things like that, yes. But again, I only got to know these people when I became a fellow.
Mm-hmm.
But,
you presumably got a first throughout.
Yeah, I got first, and I would have been deeply upset if I hadn't. I have to say. I mean, I've always been a little bit too desiring or reliant upon those sorts of recognitions, really, to just encourage one to feel that or something there. But no, I got. And in fact, all our crowd did. I mean, we had loads and loads of wranglers and things like that.
And did you go straight into a Trinity Fellowship, or?
No, well, I went straight into being a research student. And I used to say, when I was myself the senior member of a research group, I used to give a sort of avuncular talk to the starting research students at the beginning of the academic year. I used to say to them, quite honestly, the most miserable year of my life had been my first year as a research student. I found it very difficult to get going on research. It's totally different, of course, from doing tripos problems, which I was clever. The time scale is different. A hard tripos problem, or a Besikovich problem, takes you a week. There, months, time scale is months. Tripos problems are known to have solutions. Research problems may or may not have solutions with the things you have at your disposal. I just found it very difficult to get going. And I wasn't at all helped by Nick Kemmer, who I say was a very nice man, but had no particular
self-confidence.
Well, he didn't have contact with what was going on. So I had this very miserable year, and I didn't really get anywhere. And I just sort of stuck it out and felt more and more miserable. But then Kemmer left, he went off after Edinburgh. And Abdus Salam, who later on won the Nobel Prize in Physics, came, Pakistani theoretical physicist of great distinction. And I became Abdus's...
How would you spell his surname?
Salam.
Yeah.
And he absolutely knew where the action was. Curiously enough, he didn't give me a problem to work on. But the mere fact that he knew what was going on meant that you were in touch with things. And during my second year, I found a problem to work on for myself, and I completed it. It wasn't all that difficult a problem, but it was certainly one that was worth doing. And
is it possible to very simply?
Well, yes, I could explain what it was concerned with quantum field theory. All the theories of fundamental physics at that time, and indeed today, were quantum field theories. So you take a field and you add quantum mechanics to it. when you do that, you get a richer theory than you would with the two things separately. But you get a theory that is in danger of not making sense. It's full of infinities. And you have to do various tricks to remove these infinities and produce sensible answers for them. That had been worked out by a whole brilliant post-war generation of physicists, Dick Feynman and Freeman Dyson and people like that. A program called renormalization theory. And there was a little gap in they had shown that you could remove these infinities, but they applied it to something called the S matrix, which was essentially saying that the time scale in which the interactions were taking place was infinite. Now that was not a bad approximation, because the time scale, the relevant time scale, was very long compared with the characteristic time scales of the interactions. So it was a pretty sensible approximation. But of course, these manipulations are very delicate, and it seemed to me worthwhile to verify that if you had a long but finite time scale, the thing would still work. And that I was able to do, and publish that. And that formed the basis of my fellowship thesis, which I put in after 2 years. Could have 3, but I thought I'd got something to. I didn't tell my parents I was putting this in, because I didn't want them to be disappointed I didn't get in. And I travelled back to Cambridge for the beginning of my 3rd year of research on the day that the fellowship election results were announced. And I arrived in Trinity in the afternoon to find that my name on the list.
Wonderful.
as was Michael Attia's, and as was John Eliot, the distinguished historian
Oh
of
yes.
Spain, and a couple of people in their 3rd year. And that was, of course, a great experience to become a fellow. And my parents were very, very pleased, obviously. Though it was very, very important in our family not to be uppity about success. You know, so they were pleased, but you didn't rush around and tell the neighbours.
Very English. Well, did you know John Eliot at all well?
Well, I got to know John. I knew around the place. I mean, all the scholars tend to. You see, because in my day, when you came up as an undergraduate in Trinity, in your first year you lived out unless you were a scholar. But all the scholars, of course, lived in, and so we got to know each other fairly widely. But and of course, you have to dine at hall every night and things like that. So we got to know each other. So I knew John moderately well. But of course, we got to know each other much better when we became fellows together. And we see each other from time to time now and catch up with the old days. So.
Tell me something about Trinity at that time. I mean, how long were you a fellow?
I was a fellow of Trinity for more than 30 years, and I thought I expected that I would die a fellow of Trinity. I was first of all a research fellow for 4 years. Then I became then come back to Cambridge and become a lecturer in applied maths here, and I became a teaching fellow, and then I became a professorial fellow, and then I was long enough a fellow to become a life fellow. And when I went off into parish life, I was still a fellow of Trinity. But when I came back to Cambridge, I came back to be the Dean of Chapel at Trinity Hall. Of course, I became a fellow of Trinity Hall. And that automatically cancelled my Trinity fellowship perfectly reasonably. But sadly, I mean, it was a real bereavement not to be a fellow of Trinity. I mean, I'm still very much a Trinity man underneath. I mean, having been a Queen's and still being a Queen's, externally I'm a Queen's person. I like Queens and I'm grateful to it, but scratch me a bit to find a Trinity man underneath.
Okay, so what is a Trinity man?
Well, first of all, there's the sort of, the weight of past glory. I mean, it's all these, you feel that you're some tiny part of this enormous intellectual tradition. The great, I mean, in my own sort of bit of the academic world, to recite the names of Newton and Maxwell and Rutherford and Thomson and so on. Yes, I mean it is a great succession. It's a very beautiful college. Of course it's very big. And when I went to Trinity Hall, I had an entirely different college experience. But it's compensated for the fact that the congenial groups formed within the larger society. Say, in some sense, the scholars as undergraduates, particularly the mathematicians, and so on and so on. So it was, I just enjoyed it very much. And I'm still sad in some sense that I found a lot of fellow, but I mean it's totally unreasonable point of view to take. But there we are. I mean, so I go back there very occasionally, perhaps once a term, and it's nice to tread the court again.
I had one close friend who was a fellow, Peter Laslett. Did you know?
Oh yes, I know Peter Laslett. Yes. Of course, he's much older than me, but he was the sort of person you couldn't be in Trinity very long without knowing Peter. Yes. Well, university was a great marriage bureau, and I met my wife as an undergraduate. And I met her actually through Michael O'Tear. Michael was interested in somebody in Girton who was a first-year mathematician, and she wanted to ask him to tea, and the conventions of the day suggested that there should be company present on this occasion. So she asked Michael to bring somebody with him. Michael asked me, and of course her roommate was there. Her roommate was a young woman called Ruth Martin, who was also reading mathematics, and that's how we met. And Ruth was also, in those days, part of the KQ, so we tended to meet each other. We didn't meet each other in maths lectures, because Ruth was doing the slow course, and I was doing the fast course, and so we never actually went to lectures together. But we saw reasonable out to each other, and gradually sort of warmth of relationships developed. So by the time we both graduated, Ruth left Cambridge then and trained to be a statistician. In both our minds was the intention that we should get married, but of course circumstances weren't favourable to that until I became a research fellow at Trinity, and I had an income there, I had known income for 4 years. And so we got married on the 26th of March, 19, I have to stop and think for a minute, 1954. And no, wait a minute, that's going. 1955, of course, yes, that's right. In my third year as a research student. And we lived in a little flat in Trinity Street above Hobbes's sports shop. Until we went to America. I got a Commonwealth Fund fellowship, as it was called in those days, to go and work in the postdoctorate in the States. And so Ruth came with me, and we had a wonderful year in the States, because the deal was, it was a hands across the sea type of thing, and the deal was you spend 9 months working in the university of your choice, and I went to Caltech, and then you had to spend 3 months travelling around the United States to get to know the United States. And I'm very much a Protestant work ethic person. I couldn't have contemplated the thought of taking a 3-month holiday, and of course it was compulsory, in which case you had to do it. So we had this wonderful holiday zigzagging across the States, going to the national parks. Ruth had an aunt who lived in New Jersey. We spent some time with her, went on from there into New England and so on. So we had a really wonderful summer. And so that was how our married life started. And before I get further with married life, I want to say something about my year in the States on the professional side. I went to work with a very famous theoretical physicist called Murray Gell-Mann. He was only a few years older than me, but he was already a world famous figure, and he was later going to win a Nobel Prize. And he's the person who invented the name quark and the concept of quarks. And I really learned an enormous amount from Murray. I mean, he absolutely in the forefront of particle physics of the day, knew where the action was and liked to talk about it. But I also learned how you work with somebody of that kind. You have to pick up from them where the action is. But you can't stay in their immediate company too long. They will always outthink you and overpower you. And so you'll always be running along, trying to catch up. So after you've seen the sort of area where there might be something worth doing, you have to sort of retreat and figure out what you might, with your modest talents, be able to do, and do something there. So that's what I did, and in fact I wrote actually quite an important paper as a result of that. But that was
You made a contribution to the development of theories about quarks. And,
well, mostly what I did in that area was actually later on, much later on actually. The contribution I made there was working out models of what's called deep inelastic scattering. Deep inelastic scattering is when you have a projectile collides with a particle and it comes off at a very wide angle. That means it's been turned around a lot in its impact, and that means it must have hit something point-like within the target particle. And you could construct theories of these things, and you could analyze experimental results in terms of them. When you analyze the experimental results, you found that the properties of these little scattering centers, these little hard things inside, which were causing it to bounce back, had the properties of quarks. So it wasn't, nobody's directly seen a quark. They are confined, they never appear on their own. But this was one of the more direct ways of inferring that they were present within. But that came very much later, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. But I worked on something different with Murray.
You came back home, and we come back to your family.
Yeah, well, I came back to actually to my first university teaching job. I became a lecturer in Nick Keller's department in Edinburgh, and we lived in Edinburgh for 2 years. And I enjoyed university teaching very much. I'm very pedagogic. I like telling people things, and it was fun there. And again, there were research students sort of hanging around the place, not knowing quite what to do, because Nick really wasn't suggesting to them what they ought to do, and I was able to make some suggestions to some of them what they might do, and that livened up the place a bit. So that was quite a
when was it that you, I suppose it must have been Cambridge, when you were supervising or teaching Josephson?
Yes, well, that was when I came back to Cambridge. Yes, I'll stay with my personal life, and I come back to married and family life in a minute. After 2 years in Edinburgh, an opportunity came to return to Cambridge to be a lecturer in applied maths here, and I came back, and we came back, and I became a teaching fellow at Trinity, a staff fellow at Trinity, and that was a sort of established position. We bought a house in Rutherford Road, which was a very good place to have a house. We'd had our first child, our son Peter, in Edinburgh. He was born in the Simpson Maternity Memorial Pavilion, or Memorial Maternity Pavilion, a rather grand-sounding place in Edinburgh. But he was about 6 months old when we came back to Cambridge, and Rutherford Road was just a new block of houses. We thought we must buy the biggest house we could afford. It cost fully £5,000 in those days to buy this house. It seemed an absolutely enormous sum. But we bought it, and most of the other houses, it was a cul-de-sac road, most of the other houses were also occupied by people with young families. So as our children grew up, they grew up with lots of friends on the road. It was safe to trek around on the road and play on the road because it was a cul-de-sac, so that was a really very, very, very good move. And so we came back to Cambridge, and then I was continuously in Cambridge apart from sabbatical leave until I resigned to transfer the ministry. So that was a long-term engagement. And Ruth lived the conventional life of Don's wife in those days. She brought up the children. She was at home. I used to go and supervise 2 nights a week in Trinity, and would stay to dinner afterwards. And I would go into chapel on Sunday evenings, and stay to dinner afterwards. And Ruth would put the children to bed, and I would come back and find them in bed. On the other hand, I did try to make a clear separation between work, which I did in the department, and family life, which I did at home. So when I came home, I was free to be available, and on the nights when the children hadn't gone to bed, I really enjoyed reading to them, reading stories to them, and which always ended with reading a Bible story of some sort, so that was in the terms of the standards of the day, I was not a bad father, but I think the next generation were rather more domesticated than my generation were. And we had 2 more children, born in Cambridge, our daughter Isabel, and then our youngest son Michael. So we had a family of 3. And,
did Ruth get back to work later on?
Well, she didn't get back to work. I mean, she did various things. I would say that she's quite a musical person. She was quite a musical person. She played the cello. She played in Cums when she'd been an undergraduate, and she played in the Cambridge Phil when she came back. Her family were a musical family, amateur musical family, and Ruth completed the string quartet in the family. That's why she had to learn the cello. But it's a lovely instrument, and she enjoyed that. So she did that, and she was engaged in various sort of voluntary activities. She was, for a while, diocesan treasurer of the Mothers Union, things of that nature. And we were a devout family. We had an interesting system with our children. We were very anxious to help our children to grow up in the Christian faith, but we were equally anxious not to shove it down their throats. And so we devised a scheme, a sort of 2-week pattern. On the first week, I went to early communion in Trinity Chapel, came back in time for Ruth to go to the mid-morning service in Holy Trinity, which is the church we worshipped at. And on that day, the children could choose to go or not go, because they could stay with me at home. And mostly the 2 boys chose not to go, and mostly our daughter chose to go. But on the second Sunday, we all went to the mid-morning service at Holy Trinity, and you had to go unless you were ill. So that gave them some regularity, but also some choice. And in fact, eventually that system dissolved when I went to spend some time on sabbatical leave in the States, and on my own. Bruce came out with the children for the summer, but of course they were in school. And she said to the children, look, I've got to get to church every Sunday, and you'll just have to come with me. And they said, okay, we'll come with me. And they did that. And when I came back, they've got so used to that, and they've grown up in the faith, and they are Christian believers. So we didn't go back to the on-off system before. But Ruth did various things like that. But it was only when the children were beginning to leave home that she began to think about what to do next. And she had her own middle-aged adventure. She didn't want to go back to statistics, and she didn't want to teach maths in schools. All her family were teachers, and she didn't want to be another teacher. So she decided she would like to train to be a nurse. So at the same time I was training to become a priest, she was training to be a nurse, which is harder work than training for the ministry. It also takes three years rather than 2 years for me. So she then subsequently worked as a nurse for about a dozen years before she retired, and it was obviously the right thing to do. She was very satisfied by that. She did almost entirely geriatric nursing because she liked hands-on nursing rather than high-tech nursing. So that's what she did.
Well, we'll come to the ministry in a moment, but just to, there's so much more to say about your academic work and so on, but if you had to pick out sort of a couple of high points in your work as a particle physicist from that time that you came back to Cambridge, what would you
Do you mean in terms of academic achievement?
Yes.
Well, yeah, I think I choose 2 things. One would be these deep models of deep inelastic scattering that I discussed, and which I think were probably the most important piece of theoretical physics that I did, and I did it actually towards the end of my career in theoretical physics. But before that, there had been a lot of interest in trying to formulate a so-called S-matrix theory. That's to say, a theory that didn't directly appeal to quantum field theory, but simply said, you know what comes in, you know what comes out. There must be a quantum mechanical amplitude which connects one to the other. That's called the S-matrix. And this will have certain general properties, and maybe those general properties are so powerful that they will determine or almost determine the structure this has to have. But in order for that to be a hopeful program, we had to first of all determine what sort of properties these amplitudes had. And they turned out to be mathematical properties. They turned out to be concerned with analytical mathematics, to say they were concerned with their behavior, with their singularities. No mathematical function can be completely smooth, completely well behaved. The only smooth, well behaved function is a constant, which is not very interesting. All functions have to have some points where they blow up, where they are singular. And you can characterize functions by finding out what the singularities are. And I did a lot of work on a variety of models, in collaboration with lots of other people too, of course, determining what the singularity structure of these amplitudes should be. And that was work that went on over a longish period, I suppose 10 years perhaps, in one way or another. And there was a great body of information came out of that. In fact, in the end, I'm sad to say, that the S-matrix program collapsed under its own weight. We found that the properties were so complicated. The original hope was they'd be fairly simple properties, they'd be easy to handle. But we kept on finding more singularities, more structures. It became so complicated, the whole thing, as calculation or program or a formula way of formulating particle physics, it just collapsed under its own weight. I mean, these properties are part of relativistic quantum mechanics. In some sense, they are there. In some sense, they are an important part of the structure of the world. But they don't relate directly to experimentally explorable possibilities in the way that, for example, the deep and elastic scattering models did. I mean, they were directly connected with the experiments which things did bounce back. So that's my career in a nutshell, really. And I have to say that I enjoyed all that very much, and certainly regarded it as being a Christian vocation to use such talents as I had in that area. I eventually became Professor of Mathematical Physics. I was senior member of a very large and very talented research group. I loved supervising research students. It's a very satisfying thing to be able to do.
Can I mention a couple?
Well, I had a very clever student in Edinburgh called Tom Kibble. He was the first of my students to become an FRS, and he worked on variations of the Higgs theory, the Higgs boson theory, things like that. And then I had a very clever chap called Peter Goddard, who eventually became a string theorist. But that was after me. I've not been a string theorist, I'll explain in a minute. But he worked on some of these analytic problems, and eventually became a Master at St John's, and is now the Director of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And my last research student of all was a chap called James Sterling, very charming Northern Irish person who works on the sort of deep and elastic scattering models that I was interested in, has continued to work, broadly speaking, that sort of area, and is now the Jacksonian Professor in the Cabinet. So those are perhaps my three outstanding research students.
What about Martin Rees?
Well, Martin Rees I taught as an undergraduate, and I also taught Brian Josephson as an undergraduate. Undoubtedly the most talented undergraduate student I ever had was Brian Josephson. He came up very young, he was very shy, he was fantastically competent, and he could do every problem that you asked him to do. So supervisors were a nightmare in a way, because after 5 minutes he just checked he got everything right. And then I tried to sort of get a conversation going about some further aspect of theoretical physics, and he really was unresponsive. I mean, he was very shy and so on, and I just couldn't make this chap out. And at the end of the term I had to write a supervision report. And I thought, what should I say about this chap? Why is he so... So what I wrote was, obviously, extremely technically competent, but may lack originality. And within 5 years of that, he'd done work that won him a Nobel Prize. So it's an act of spiritual exercise, really, to recall from time to time this spectacular misjudgment. I also taught Martin Rees quantum mechanics, which is what I powered most. And he was a much more forthcoming student. Of course, he was a pleasure to teach. He was obviously very clever, but I hadn't seen, and bear no credit for, the fact that he's turned out to be such a creative physicist. That I hadn't seen, and he worked, of course, in different sorts of problems, like astrophysical problems, principally. But they were two very gifted students. But I had a lot of interesting, clever undergraduates to teach, and all my research students got a PhD in the end. Some of them only by the skin of their teeth, I have to say, but they all managed to do it.
How many did you have?
I had about 27, 28 research students over the years, something like that. I mean, I really enjoyed having them, because we all worked in the department, so we all saw each other at coffee and tea, and you go down the corridor, and blackboards are an essential part of the life of any theoretical physicist. Everybody has a blackboard in their room, and so you go down and write some equations on the blackboard and discuss them. In the new Centre for Mathematical Sciences, they have blackboards in the lifts, just in case you think of a beautiful equation when you're going up and down. We didn't have that.
Do you think the shift from the old Cavendish to the new Cavendish has had much of an effect in...
Well, it didn't have any effect on me, because I wasn't in the Cavendish. I was in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics. Yeah. And we hung out in the old press building for a long while, and now they're out at this grand new complex of mathematical buildings in Wilberforce Road, the CMS. So it didn't, I mean, obviously we had some contact with people in the Cavendish, but most of the particle physics was in DAFTP, and so we were there.
Well, it's one of the striking things about your life is obviously the fact that having become right at the top of a particular profession in Cambridge, you then decided to move sideways and retrain yourself. Can you remember the moment when you decided to do that?
Well, I can't remember the moment, because I don't think there was exactly a moment, but I can remember the process by which I came to do that.
Tell me.
First thing I want to say is I didn't leave physics because I was disillusioned with it. I enjoyed being a theoretical physicist. I regarded it as being a Christian vocation to use such talents as I had, and so on. But in these mathematically based subjects, you don't get better as you get older. What counts is mental flexibility rather than accumulated experience. And while it's unlikely that you've done your best work before you're 25, it's very likely that you've done your best work by the time you're 45. So that was one factor when I passed my 45th birthday. The second thing was the subject was changing its character, very much changing its character. All the time I worked in particle physics, it had been, though there were very, very clever theorists around, it had been essentially experimentally driven. The experimentalists were always finding some new thing. They were saying, God, how can we make sense of that? And that was a pretty healthy state of affairs, and it eventually led, in the second half of the 1970s, to the so-called standard model, which is the quark structure of matter, and so on. But then the input from experiment began to dry up. The experiments were too expensive to do, many of them, and a mode of really extraordinary speculative freedom came upon particle physics, and so-called string theory began to come into existence. And for the last, the last 25 years, it's dominated my sort of theoretical physics. Very clever people are involved in it, and it's very sensible to try and explore the richness of putting quantum theory and relativity theory together. But it is highly speculative theory. People don't hesitate to say, okay, it only works in 10 or 11 dimensions of space-time, therefore there must be 10 or 11 dimensions of space-time. They say, okay, the theory, which it was originally hoped the theory would be unique or almost unique, now we know that the theory has something like 10 to the 500 different sets of possible consequences. So people say, yeah, for sure, there must be 10 to the 500 different universes in which all these things. It's purporting to speak about what happens in the physical realm, 16 orders of magnitude, 16 powers of 10, beyond anything in which we have direct experimental experience. And 16 orders of magnitude take you from a city of the size of Cambridge to something smaller than an atom. That's a very big leap of the human imagination, and the lessons of history are against it. So the subject has changed its character, and the new string theories involved new types of mathematics, which I didn't really know it, I'd have to learn, and B, I was losing mental flexibility, and C, I was not really very congenially disposed towards its speculative character. So I thought the time had come to do something different. That was the push part of it.
Yeah. And the pull part was?
The pull part was Christianity has always been central to my life. And I had the experience of becoming a lay reader at Holy Trinity. I did occasional preaching, lent a hand with services. Of course, didn't have a Eucharistic ministry because that belongs to the ordained. And I found great value and satisfaction in doing that. So when I began to, and I'd long thought that I would have stayed in theoretical physics all my life. I'd do something else. But it was only past my 45th birthday I began to think seriously about what that something else might be. And of course to talk to Ruth about it, because obviously it had to be a joint decision between us. And quite quickly, not in a flash, but quite quickly and quite naturally, and without drama really, unfortunately in both our minds, the idea of seeking ordination seemed the right thing to do, a worthwhile thing to do. It was of course a big change, and I don't say I didn't feel quivery about it from time to time, but it did seem to be the right thing. And the next thing you had to do was to go off to a so-called selection conference where the church would test your vocation. And that was a very helpful experience because you go, there's a group of a dozen or 15 people there who want to be ordinands, and there are wise and experienced people there who have individual conversations with you. You worship, of course, together. You do some collective things. You each take turns leading a discussion group on some assigned topic. You draw out a hat, things of that nature. They sort of suss you out over about 3 or 4 day period in a retreat house somewhere. And at the end, they can either say yes or no or wait. And they said yes to me, I'm going to say. And I was pleased about that, and so on, and helped by that, because one of the things that comforted me there was no sign on the part of these experienced people, the selectors, that they were at all impressed, as they should not have been, of course, by the fact that I was an FRS and a Cambridge professor. I mean, they were looking at me as a believer and as a potential priest, and that was very helpful. And in the end, they said yes. And then I had to begin winding up my academic affairs. Of course, I couldn't just leave and say to my PhD students, cheerio, hope you get a degree. So I had an 18-month period where it was known that I was going to leave physics, but I still haven't yet left it. And I remember very vividly the day, of course I told them, it had been a secret between Ruth and me and one or two close friends, until I got the verdict that I was going to be able to do this. Then, of course, I told the family. And then, very soon on that, I told my colleagues in the department. We had a meeting one day, we were choosing postdocs for next year, and we got through that business.
How old were you at this time this happened? Which year was it?
Well, I have to think back. This would be
Roughly.
It would be sometime early in 1978 when we were looking for postdocs for the following year. And when we finished the business, I said, "Don't go yet, I've got something to tell you." And then I told them what I was going to do. And there was frankly, there was a sort of stunned silence for about half a minute. Nobody quite knew what to say. And then one of my colleagues, Peter Lansoff, with whom I'd done a lot of work, and who's not a religious believer, said, he was the first person to pluck up his courage to say something. He said, "John, I wouldn't have guessed you were going to do this, but if you told me you were going to leave physics, I would have guessed this is what you were going to do." And that was a nice thing to say. At least I felt so. And then other people said various things. And of course the news spread around very quickly, not only in the department, but theoretical particle physics was a sort of international intellectual village. We all knew each other. And so things spread around quite quickly in that community. And in those 18 months when I was winding up my academic affairs, I had a number of conversations over a cup of coffee in a laboratory at canteen where people said to me, "John, what are you up to?" And they were not so much asking me why I was going to become a clergyman, but why I was a Christian at all. And in 20 minutes or so, I'd try and say something about my motivations for Christian belief. Obviously, you couldn't say much that was really adequate in so short a time. But eventually it formed in my mind what I would have said to them if I'd had 6, 7, 8 hours in which to do so. And that was eventually formed the basis, the first book I wrote about science and religion, which was a small book with a grandiose title, The Way the World Is. But that came significantly later.
Can you move it down from 8 hours to 20 minutes to 3 or 4 minutes? What is the theme of the book? And what?
Well, the theme of the book there's a twofold theme of the book. First of all, the world that science explores is wonderfully ordered. I mean, they have these beautiful pattern structures of the physical world that science explores, and also amazingly fruitful. A ball of energy is turned into the home of saints and scientists. The fruitful history of life, a world that for 2 billion years or more only had bacteria, now has human beings in it. So there's that sort of fruitfulness. And you have to be careful how you discuss this, of course, but I think you can discuss it in a careful way, a truth-seeking way, which supports, to me, in my mind, the notion that there is a divine mind behind the order and a divine purpose behind the unfolding fruitful history. And that would give you a picture of God, I suppose, as something like the cosmic architect or the great mathematician or something like that. There were many unanswered questions about the nature of God. Does God, for example, the world of this vast universe, care for individual human beings? That's a entirely different question, which you can't settle that way. And that's where my Christian belief comes in. My Christian belief really centres on the figure of Jesus Christ, as I meet him in the New Testament, in the church and in the sacraments. And he's somebody I just absolutely have to take seriously, take into account. And the pivot of my Christian belief really is belief that Jesus was raised from the dead, the first Easter day, a very counterintuitive belief, obviously, but I think a true belief. And again, I write books and arguments about this sort of thing, but in a nutshell, there's something very strange about Jesus. He draws the crowds, he says wise things, then everything seems to collapse. on that last visit to Jerusalem. He's arrested, painful, shameful death, a death that any first century Jew would see as a sign of God's rejection. Curses everyone hung on a tree, deserted by his followers, they all run away. Cry of dereliction, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus' life, that first Good Friday, seems to end in failure. And I think that if it had ended there, actually we probably wouldn't have heard of him. I think he would have just been yet another first century messianic pretender. There were several who, in the end got his comeuppance for pretensions beyond his status. But we've all heard of Jesus. Something continued the story of Jesus. And I think and all the New Testament writers say it was that he was raised from the dead the third day. Now, of course, you have to look at that very carefully. You have to look at the appearance stories, you have to look at the empty tomb stories, you have to try and be scrupulous in evaluating them, and so on. But I think I do try and do that. I think you could do that, and I do believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, was resurrected, and that's the other side of the thing. And therefore, that leads me to believe that Jesus really is, as Christian belief came to formulate, God living a human life to make manifest in the most accessible way the nature of God through that human life. So does God care for people? Well, did Jesus care for people? That's terribly shorthand and begs an enormous number of questions, but I do try and address those questions both in my own mind and when I write about these things.
Well, let's pursue just one or two of the aspects of it. One is your life, and what you've said seems to go against the view that is being contested widely at the moment, which is that science and religion are in a mutually antagonistic relationship, and that science, in the words of, or the implications of Dawkins's work, disproves religion.
Yes, well, I'm really saddened to read Dawkins's writing, because I think it's so polemical. And it doesn't have the signs of being truth-seeking at all, it seems to me. I mean, it's full of assertion, it's full of distorted evidence. I mean, pages and pages and pages about terrible things that religious people have done, and they have done terrible things. And we were...
And Christopher Hitchens as well. I mean,
sorry?
And Christopher Hitchens
I
as
haven't
well.
read Hitchens, actually, curiously. I really must get around to reading him sometime. But these new modern atheists. But I mean, then Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, well, that's not really too serious. I mean, that seems to me just dishonest. So I do think, I do think that science and religion basically are friends and not foes. And basically I think they're friends. Again, this is something that requires a lot of unpacking. Basically I think they're friends because they're both concerned with the search for truth. I mean, truth is certainly as essential to religion, questions of truth, as it is to science. The truth attainable through motivated belief. And though, of course, obviously the kinds of truth and the kinds of motivations are different between the two, but I think they have a cousinly relationship to each other. And so that I'd like to say that I'm two-eyed. I look at the world with the eye of science, for sure. I look at the world with the eye of religion, and I think that binocular vision enables me to see more than either eye would do on its own. And I absolutely never felt in my life that I faced an either-or crisis situation. Got to go for science or got to go for religion. I need both. And so it's both and for me. And of course there are puzzles about how they relate to each other. And I think and struggle and write about those. But I don't see an incompatibility. I certainly don't see a warfare.
So the belief that began to spring up in the 19th century, that somehow rational experimental science was, and post-Darwinian thought was somehow disproving God, showing an alternative, and that you couldn't continue, you feel was just an gross oversimplification.
Well, not only feel it was a gross oversimplification, but also I think it's a very partial account of actual 19th century thought and history. If you think about all the great physicist figures of the 19th century, you think about Faraday, about Maxwell, Kelvin, J.J. Thomson. They were all actually people of religious belief and didn't have to feel difficulties. There were more difficulties on the biological side, and that's remained the case, partly because, of course, biologists see a much more ambiguous picture of the world. They see fruitfulness, but they also see extinctions and parasitisms and things like that. It is a more ambiguous story, and religious people have to take that ambiguity seriously. But even when we think about 1859 and the origin of species, the idea that all the scientists said yes to Darwin and all the religious people said no to Darwin is of course untrue. There were religious people who from the start welcomed Darwin's ideas. Charles Kingsley, a creation in which creatures can make themselves, how you understood an evolving universe. Aubrey Moore at Oxford said Darwin, in the guise of a foe, done the work of a friend by giving a picture of a God who works through natural processes, and therefore not a distant God adheres them. And equally, of course, there were lots of difficulties on the scientific side with Darwin's ideas until genetics, Mendel's discovery of genetics, were recovered in the 20th century to explain the small variations on which evolutionary processes has to work. So it's a complicated story.
You're assailed from the Dawkins side, but you're also assailed from what Dawkins is one of the reasons that Dawkins writes, which is creationism and fundamentalism in America. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel sad about all that. I have to say, yes. I mean, one of Dawkins' techniques, polemic techniques, is to put up the straw man from Arkansas, who says for sure the Earth is 6,000 years old, as the typical religious believer. Well, I'm sorry about that, and I'm astonished at the degree to which that sort of belief is prevalent in the United States. I mean, I go to the States quite often, and people will pop up and put you right about these things as they believe it. It saddens me because, for two reasons, well, three reasons really. One is, first of all, these are people who I think genuinely are seeking to serve the God of truth, and they're refusing some of the truth that comes to them, the truth that science is able to provide. It doesn't provide the whole truth, it certainly provides some of it, and they should be grateful for that and take it seriously. I'm sad for a second reason that they are insisting on a literal, flat-footed interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. They are seeking to bind burdens on people seeking religious belief, which they should not be asked to bear. Thirdly, it's a very brittle position. If some of these people get convinced that evolution, for example, is the true account of, or a substantial part of the true account of the history of life, then maybe everything goes. Not just their views about the age of the earth, but their whole religious belief as well. And I suppose the fourth reason, come to think of it, is that these people, though they want to be respectful to Scripture, are in fact abusing Scripture, because they are reading Genesis 1 and 2 as if it was a divinely dictated scientific textbook. They're not respecting the genre of Genesis 1 and 2, which is not scientific, but of course theological. The purpose of Genesis 1 is to say nothing exists except through the will of God. So it's a real terrible mess, and it upsets me that it seems to be, as I say, so prevalent, particularly in the United States.
I don't often have this chance to ask such questions that I asked when I was 17 or 18 again. Okay. One of them was the problem of evil.
Yes.
I mean, one wants to believe.
Yeah.
And then you turn on your television and you see the usual horrors occurring. And you think, well, I know free will and all the arguments about this, but couldn't such a clever God have designed a system whereby you can avoid some of this mayhem? And if he is all-powerful and all-knowing, how can he allow this to happen?
Well, I don't doubt at all that the problem of evil and suffering is the most difficult problem of religious belief. I think it holds more people back from religious belief than anything else, and troubles those who are believers more than anything else. I do think, as far as moral evil is concerned, the chosen cruelties and neglects of humankind, that the free will defence has some power to it. It's not clear to me that God could have produced a world in which people freely always choose to do the good. That seems to me not at all clear. I think in some ways more troubling is natural evil, because I mean, wars and famines and things, wars and not famines, but wars and genocides and things are clearly substantially human responsibilities. But disease and disaster seem much more the responsibility of the Creator. I mean, we don't make earthquakes or invent the HIV virus and things like that. And there I think actually science is mildly helpful. I mean, there is no one-line answer to these problems, but science is mildly helpful through this notion that an evolving world is a great good because it's a world of good in which creatures are free to make themselves, not a divine puppet theory, but creatures are allowed to explore and bring to birth the fruitfulness, the potentiality with which the creation has been endowed. That's a great good, but it has an inescapable shadow side, because the shuffling explorations of chance, of happenstance, which is what the evolutionary process is, will of course have great fruitfulness, but also will have ragged edges and blind alleys. Genetic mutation will produce new forms of life. It will also produce malignancy. You can't have one without the other in a non-magic world. The world's not magic because God's not a capricious magician. I think that is somewhat helpful in relation to this. It suggests that disease and disaster is not gratuitous, not something that a God who was a bit more competent or a bit less callous could easily have dealt with. And then there is a specific Christian answer to, or a response rather than answer, a response to the problem of evil and suffering in that way, which is to see the cross of Christ as God's actual participation as a fellow sufferer in the suffering of creation. The Christian God is not simply a compassionate spectator up in the invulnerability of heaven, but has been caught up and impaled on the contradictions of this world in that lonely figure, paradoxically experiencing God-forsakenness and the darkness of Calvary. That's a very deep, mysterious, to me extremely important insight, and it is a very important part of what makes Christian faith possible for me in relation to these things.
The other question which occurred to me particularly when I was 17 or 18, I began to think about other parts of the world, and when I became an anthropologist and looked at the religions of Asia particularly, and when people said to me, well, of course they may be nice enough people, but they're damned. They haven't found the Christ, and without him there is no salvation for them. That is the point at which I rejected my Christian upbringing. What is your feeling about the other world religions?
Well, I think actually the second biggest problem for religions is to think about the diversity of the world's faith traditions. I certainly, of course, don't think that Hindus and Buddhists are all damned. That's a very crude and terrible mistake about the mercy of God. I do believe that in the end, all must come to God through Christ, because I believe that Christ is the unique link between the life of divinity and the life of creatures. But that doesn't mean that only people who know Christ by name in this life are going to be able to cross that bridge. That's one thing. But I am disturbed and puzzled and troubled by the diversity of the world faith traditions. In one sense, they're all speaking about the same domain of human experience, of some sort of encounter with sacred reality. But they say such different things about it. They have things in common. I think all the world faith traditions value compassion, all testify to the unitive experiences of mystic encounter and so on. But they say such different things about other things. I mean, the Abrahamic faiths see the human being as a unique and abiding significance. Our Hindu friends think that the human being is recycled through reincarnation. Our Buddhist friends, if I understand anatta aright, believe that the self is an illusion, ultimately, from which to seek release. Now, those aren't three different sets of people saying the same thing in different cultural languages. There are three different sets of people saying three different things. And I'm just deeply puzzled by that. And I'm particularly unnerved by that, of course, as a scientist, because though science started, let's say, in 17th century Western Europe, now it's worldwide. You stop somebody in the street in London, in Delhi, in Kyoto, and ask them what matter's made of, you choose the right person, they say quarks and gluons. You ask them about ultimate reality, you'll probably get three very different answers. It is puzzling and unnerving, and I think that we're just beginning to struggle with this problem, because the multi-faith, multi-ethnic character of our society means that these people in other faiths, this of course was never true of the Jews, but people in other faiths, not curious people in faraway countries who believe odd things, they're our neighbours down the street. And we can see that they have an authenticity in their spiritual lives that is not to be gainsaid. But nevertheless, there are these clashes of belief. I'm deeply puzzled by it.
Last question, if I may. This is about Cambridge. I'm
Yes.
very interested in Cambridge. I found it a fruitful place to be and think. And I imagine from your productivity that you have too. What do you think is special about Cambridge as a place for intellectual and emotional life?
Well, I think there are a number of things that are special about Cambridge. One is obviously the collegiality of Cambridge. The fact that this big university is split into these these small intellectual villages where you actually do meet people who are working on all sorts of different subjects. And though, as you and I know, conversation on the high table is not always at the most elevated academic level, nevertheless you do have contact with people working in widely different disciplines, and that in itself is very stimulating. It's a beautiful place in which to live. It's a great privilege to be able to move around in these beautiful buildings. Ruth and I have the privilege of living for 7 years in the President's Lodge in Queens, which is a really lovely place to live. In. There's the weight of history, the tradition, the feeling that you're a little element in this ongoing stream of knowledge that's been going for 800 years, and so on. And just more generally, I'm not a big town person, but Cambridge is just the right size for me, not too big. And because of the university, it has cultural resources far in excess of what you would expect in an average town of our size, and that's a great gift, to have a lot of cultural facilities in a city which you can actually get around.
Is there anything that you would have liked me to ask you?
Well, I would very much like to say something, but this will have to be on another occasion, I think. I would very much like to say something about my experiences and training for the ministry, and being a parish priest, coming back into the university, and indeed even being the head of a house. So,
well, would you like to have just a shorter session another time?
yes, I would actually, if that's agreeable. We could do all that well within an hour, probably less than an hour. But if I leave that hour, I just add a big chunk of my life, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just stop there for now then.
Yes, that would be perfect. Yeah.
John, you have really lived two lives, one as a particle physicist and then as an ordained priest. Let's hear something more about the second. I mean, the training. Let's start with the training for the priesthood as compared for the training as a physicist. Can you tell me about the differences?
Yes, well, I went to Westcott House in 1979, just before my 49th birthday, and it was a very funny experience becoming a student again. I was very used to standing up and talking for an hour, and I found it was much more difficult to sit and listen for an hour, and I used to get a bit restive after about 45 minutes. But there were many things I had to learn, and I enjoyed all the courses I went to. I particularly enjoyed the New Testament courses. If you're a scientist, your instinct is to say, what are the foundational phenomena we're trying to understand here? And for me, in Christianity, that's contained in the New Testament witness. So I enjoyed those very much. I had taught myself elementary New Testament Greek before I went to Westcott, and I learnt a bit of Hebrew when I was there, so which was, again, quite useful. Not become scholarly in these things, but to be able to use commentaries that are based on those texts. So I enjoyed all that, and I was the oldest person in the house. I was older than the principal, Mark Santa, and most of my contemporaries as students were talented young people in the second half of the 20s. I felt very sort of aged and wise at times, having all that much more experience of life. But I also lived a double life. I mean, I got tired of being a student all the time, but I could walk up Jesus Lane back to Trinity and turn into a don again, because I'd given up my professorship. The college kindly allowed me to work my way through Westcott by teaching for Trinity. So I taught, and I remained, of course, a fellow. And so I could have relief from student ways and student food from time to time. And it was a very interesting 2 years. Leading to ordination, and the Church of England believes in the apprentice system still. There are lots of things about being a clergyman you can only learn on the beat, so to speak. I mean, you've learned some theory and stuff. So you have to do 3 years under the supervision of an experienced priest, serve your title as we call it. And I did most of my title in a large working class parish in South Bristol, in Bedminster. I was glad to go to Bristol, because my mother was still alive, living in Wells, and we were of course quite close to her being there. And also because Bristol was the big town of my youth. I'd grown up in Somerset, and I felt returning home, going back to the west of England. And that was a very interesting experience. A lot of the time you just sort of cruise around really. You hear old ladies, I'm not feeling very well, you go around and see how she is and that sort of thing. And what I learned, one of the things I learned from being in Bedminster, our pit was called Windmill Hill, and I hadn't realised that you can have a village within a big city. I mean, Windmill Hill was a working class area, but typically people lived in the house that Mum and Dad had bought in the 30s. It was a very stable community. They knew their neighbours. If the old lady opposite didn't take in the milk, they went across to see how she was. And they also had a very sort of constrained notion of the neighbourhood, really. I remember going to visit an old lady, and she told me, I said, "She got any family?" She said, "Yes, I've got a married daughter." So I said, "Does she live nearby?" And her sort of face fell, and she said, "No, she lives at Whitchurch," which was a mile and a half up the road. So it really was a local thing. So I enjoyed my time there. The intellectual side of me really wasn't exercised very much at all. There were one or two people in the parish who were interested in science, religion, and things, and of course I would talk to them. But mostly I was just learning the job, really. And after I'd done that, I was licensed to go solo, and I became the vicar of a largish village outside Canterbury called Blean. Curious, straggly place topographically, because there were various underground springs and things, so you could build here but not there. But very coherent socially, despite the fact that Canterbury was only 3 miles away. The village didn't look down the road all the time. And it was a community, and the church had a real role in that. And so, you know, I would be expected to be at the village flower show. I would go to the pensioners' afternoon from time to time. They insisted on giving me a raffle ticket every time I went. I embarrassingly frequently won prizes.
Well, this confirmed your hotline to...
Well, I don't think I could claim that as an answer to prayer. It's a packet of biscuits or a pot of jam. It wasn't anything too exciting. Again, I enjoyed it very much. Again, the intellectual side of me was not too exercised. Though part of the agreement was that I would have some spare time to do a bit of writing, and in fact I wrote a book called One World about science and religion, which was my first serious book about science and religion, really, and was quite successful. After I'd been there 2 years, I went to have an interview with Bishop of Dover, who was my sort of boss, really. He ran the diocese for the Archbishop, who obviously had other things to think about. And I talked to him, and I said, I'm enjoying being at Blean, but I'd like in the longer term to find a job which perhaps had a more intellectual component to it, than if possible, in that sort of parish life. And he said yes, he thought he could see what I was talking about. And I thought I was simply making a marker for several years hence. The church is a very odd place. It's become less odd, but it's still quite odd in how you find jobs. Some are advertised, much more advertised now than used to be. But you know, you need to have somebody, a bishop, watching your interests, really. And so I thought I was putting up a marker. Within about 6 months of having that conversation, I was rung up by somebody I knew not too well, but a bit, in Trinity Hall, who said, "We're looking for a new dean, and we'd like to interview you." So I went and was interviewed, and they offered me the job. I then had to make up my mind whether I was going to accept it. I mean, I'd made it clear to them I'd have to think about it, because I'd only been in the parish about 2.5 years, which wasn't very long. And my wife also was very reluctant to leave Blean. She really enjoyed village life. She enjoyed the Women's Institute and all that sort of thing. So I went to see the Bishop of Dover again, and I told him what the situation was, and he said to me, "I think you've been offered the job you described to me when you last came to see me," which was a very wise and helpful thing to do. So after a bit of hesitation, I did accept the job, and we returned to Cambridge. And that was funny, really, because we'd been away, I suppose about 5 years almost, and people rushed up and said, "You must be terribly glad to be back," because Cambridge people think there's nowhere else to be.
Yeah.
And I would say, well, it's not quite as simple as that. And Ruth would sometimes just say no, but she reconciled herself to being back here, and I enjoyed Trinity Hall very much. It was an interesting job because it had, of course, a liturgical and pastoral aspect. I mean, I ran the worship chapel. I did what I could pastorally in the college. I wasn't terribly good with undergraduates. I wasn't in the bar at 11 in the evening, and I had to do what I could, but I had some contacts there, and with dons and the college staff, I had quite a lot of pastoral work of one sort or another to do. And I, of course, directed studies in theology in Trinity Hall, and I had a chance to write. So it was a very, I enjoyed the hall very much. Trinity was large and grand and rich. Trinity Hall was comfortably off, small and domestic, and I really enjoyed that they had this very good system that every Tuesday there would be a dinner for fellows only, and most of the fellows came. It was a real sort of binding occasion. And so I enjoyed all that, and I would have been perfectly happy to have stayed there for the rest of my academic life. But one day, my phone rang again, and somebody I knew in Queens, from my maths days actually, said to me, "We're looking for a new president, and we thought, would you like to be considered?" So I said, out of the blue, you know. So I thought, well, I've got to say yes or no. So I said, yes, I would like to be considered, but again, I will have to think about it very carefully if this becomes serious. And he said, yeah, I understand that, and you understand also that nothing at all may come of this. So I said, yeah, I understood that, because colleges obviously look around and so on. So nothing happened in about 3 weeks, and then somebody rang me up. In fact, the vice president rang me up and said, we'd like you to come to dinner, and after dinner to answer a few questions. So I went in, I paid very nicely at dinner, and used the right knives and forks and everything, and after dinner we sat round, and most of the fellowship was there, and they just asked me lots of questions, about an hour and a half. And I thought to myself, I don't know whether this is the right job for me or not, so I felt very relaxed. I thought, I'll just say what's in my mind, and we'll just see what happens. And we had a very interesting conversation of one sort or another. And at the end of the evening, they said, thank you very much, and I went away, and I didn't hear anything for another couple of weeks, and then I was rang up again and said, we'd like you to bring your wife round to lunch. And I thought, this is really getting serious now. So I contacted 3 senior bishops who knew me quite well, including the Archbishop of York, John Hepwood. And I explained to them that I might be offered the presidency of Queen's. And I was unsure whether to take that, because of course it's a secular job. Though of course, with the college chapel, and I knew Brian Hebblethwaite, the Dean of Queen's, very well, I knew I would have a role in the college chapel, and so on. And they all actually, interestingly, independently gave me the same advice, which was they said that they thought there was some merit in some clergymen holding secular jobs if they had the experience to do the job. And then eventually I was offered the job. And then there was just one final little thing to be sorted out. Queen's of course had double sets, and there was an agitation among the students to allow mixed sharing in double sets, which had not been allowed in college beforehand. And the governing body was about to make up its mind about that. Well, I have my own personal morality is pretty straight down the middle Christian morality. I believe sexual relationships are properly exercised within lifelong commitment of marriage. I realise that not everybody takes that point of view, and I realise also that colleges no longer stand in loco parentis to people. But I thought that, I'm not at all in favour of colleges trying to pry into people's relationships, but I thought to allow double sharing would be an institutional acceptance of something that I personally myself didn't want to sign up to. So I said that I would wait and see what they did, and if they decided to allow mixed double sharing, I would have to say I wouldn't accept the presidency. I didn't try and put any pressure on them. It would be a foolish thing to try in any case. But in the end, they didn't accept it, and so I became the president. That was a little sort of glitch. And then of course we moved into Queen's.
And how long were you there?
I was there for 7 years. We lived in this wonderful lodge. I mean, it really was a lovely place to live in. And we enjoyed that very much. And we had nice staff who helped us with it, of course, as we needed to have. Just after we moved in, there was a census. And the census included also a questionnaire about accommodation. And one of the questions was, not counting kitchens and bathrooms, how many rooms do you have in your house? And the answer for us was 20. And how many people lived there? We had no resident staff. The answer was 2. And you felt a desire to write in the margin, this is not as scandalous as it sounds. But we did in fact use all the rooms, and it was a nice place. I enjoyed Queen's, I'm not, I mean, I think one of the key things in being head of a house is to realise you're not the CEO, that you have to carry people with you, you have to sway the governing body. And I like that. I mean, I'm not a CEO by temperament. I like trying to find consensus between people. Of course, the governing body didn't always do what I thought was the best thing to do, but by and large, we didn't have any sort of pitched battles. And it wasn't a factional college. It was a pleasant place to be. We did a lot of entertaining, of course, and so on. It was satisfying. I wasn't a very enterprising person. I didn't produce any great, enormous change. The college had had a long building experience, building Crips Court and so on, and they needed a bit of a rest from that, which suited me too, actually, though of course I would have tried to do that. And when I'd been interviewed, I said to them, of course I would do what I could for fundraising and be friendly with alumni, though of course I had to start essentially from scratch in that area. I didn't know any old Queen's people. But that I wasn't naturally gifted or didn't have a natural taste for fundraising. Some people like, you know, getting the chap in the corner that doesn't leave till you've got the checkbook out. It's not my style. So they knew that and accepted that. And actually, 2 years after I retired in 96, 98 was the, 550th anniversary of the college. And that was a big fundraising account. And my successor, who is absolutely a natural,
John Eatwell,
this sort of thing, really coped with all that, and of course kept very well.
Were you able to do any science while you were?
Well, I'd given up science. I mean, of course, I kept an interest in science. I mean, I read Nature and things like that, and I see the drift of things. I was able to do a fair amount of writing about science and religion. Yes. So that was one of the things I missed in parish. I missed two things in parish life when I was working there, which I was glad to get back to when I came back into the academic world again. One was working with colleagues. Of course, you were working with people all the time in parish, but you have delicate relationships. It's not so easy to say, what do you think of blogs? You have to feel your way about that. And you have a fairly sort of lonely life. I think that's one of the problems for clergy. I mean, I used to go to chapter meetings, the local deanery clergy, and people would stagger in with these enormous diaries as big as gospel books, I think to emphasise how busy they were, and as a sort of justification. So I missed working with colleagues, and the other thing I missed was the rhythm of term and vacation. Because though term is busy, there's always vacation, and think you can get on with things. Parish life, of course, is 52 weeks a year, chugging away. So, and I did make quite a lot of use of vacation time to write things. But I also, I mean, being the head of a house is not absolutely full time in a sense. It does give you, at least in my experience, it gives you room for some of your own work. And I think it's quite important actually that heads of houses do have some sort of active academic interest. I mean, I don't mean to say it's impossible to have a retired diplomat or that sort of thing, because obviously there have been very successful cases, but it does help if you understand what the business of the community is, really.
Well, one of our provosts at King's was Patrick Braitry, a section anyway of the Royal Society, which perhaps leads us off into the question of the Royal Society. And you may or may not want to say anything about the recent dispute about the pressure that was put on the education officer at the Royal Society to resign.
Let me say first of all that I long to be an FRS, and it took me a little bit longer to get elected than I thought it might be. And I actually say in my autobiography that if somebody has proposed to me some extraordinary plan by which murdering my grandmother would have facilitated my election, I of course would have said no, but there would have been a pause for mental strife before I did so.
Can this go on the internet?
Yes, I think so, yes. Well, I put it in my autobiography, so that's public knowledge. I'm very sad, really, about this recent episode of the Royal Society with their educational advisor, Michael Rice, whom I know moderately well. And he made it perfectly clear in a letter to the Times that what he had said at this meeting of the British Association of Advancement of Science was, of course, that evolution is far and away the best explanation of the history of life and the diversity of life. that creation science is not science and is not scientifically supported. But he also said that if in a science lesson some person raised the creation thing, they shouldn't simply be told to shut up. They should have explained to them that this wasn't the accepted way of thinking about things, but they should be treated with some degree of respect. And that seems to be an entirely reasonable thing to say. But he was the victim of a soundbite culture which somehow plucked out a sentence and in such a way as to twist its meaning. So he seemed to be saying you should teach creation science in science lessons. And of course, if that had been the case, I can see that they're all should have got rid of it. But they should. And my understanding, which is gossip understanding really, is that the initial stance was to support him, but then some fairly militant fellows made such a fuss that they caved in. And I very much regret that. I think the Royal Society comes badly out of this particular episode.
Thank you. Returning back actually to theology, Queen's is the space between kings and queens, and particularly kings and St. Cats. There's a lane there which I think used to be called something like Whitefriars or White Hart Lane. And there was a pub there that was known as Little Germany. You probably know all this.
Yes,
I've always been struck by how important Cambridge was in the Reformation with Latimer, Ridley, Cranmer and the rest of it. I wondered if you are interested in the history of Anglicanism and Protestantism in Cambridge, and whether you could sketch in anything about Cambridge's role in theology and the rise of Anglicanism.
Well, I'm certainly interested in the history of Anglicanism, and it's quite true, of course, that the English Reformation was largely, intellectually at least, inspired from Cambridge. The bishops you mentioned came from Cambridge and were burnt at Oxford, as people say about these things. And then the whole Cambridge has played an interesting role over the centuries in that respect. I mean, one of the persons who got the old-fashioned natural theology of the going was John Ray, who was, of course, a pioneer of taxonomy, and also wrote a book, The Wisdom of God and the Works of Creation, which was very, very influential. And William Penley, who I suppose represents the peak of that sort of movement, was also a Cambridge man and quite a Christ man. And of course, it was another Christ man, Charles Darwin, who drew the rug from that particular form of argument with the publication of The Origin of Species. So there's a whole succession there. In the 19th century, the great strength of Cambridge was in New Testament studies and criticism. Westcott, Lightfoot and Hort were all people of very great scholarly ability, very great scholarly scrupulosity too, and had played a very fundamental role in developing that kind of studies in this country. Somehow the English style of doing that sort of study was careful, but not as skeptically inclined as much of the German scholarship was. So there was a sort of corrective there. And of course, that's continued until fairly recently. I mean, Charlie Mole was undoubtedly a distinguished figure in that respect. So Cambridge has had quite a good record in that respect.
What about the evangelical side? I mean, Charles Simeon and...
Yes, well, Charles Simeon obviously was a very influential figure, and I suppose the Kiku has remained an active thing here. I spoke earlier of my undergraduate involvement with it, but with some gratitude and some regret. And as far as I know, that still continues. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things in my lifetime among student Christianity in Cambridge has been the decline and disappear of the SCM, which was the sort of more liberal-minded counterbalance to the Evangelical Christian Union, which turned tremendously Marxist in late 60s and withered away because of that, and has not really re-established itself.
That's this student Christian movement.
Student Christian movement, which was probably about as numerically large as the Kiku in the 50s and so on, but it's now, as far as I'm aware, very thin on the ground.
I mean, as soon as one starts thinking about this, one thinks of other the Neoplatonist movement.
But that's all. That's yes, of course. That's also true.
Henry Moore and so on.
Yes, yes.
Must have been very distinctively Cambridge, but also seems to be a constant search for some solution to the problem of threats to religion. I mean that movement then, and later on with well, more in Oxford, but C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams and so on.
Yes, yes. I have a sort of some ambiguous feelings about that. I mean, of course, there's powerfulness in that, and the emphasis on a rich view of reality, so that you don't have reductionist views, and you allow a very positive role for the mental and the spiritual. That seems to me important. I mean, Platonism has had an ambiguous influence on Christianity. I mean, it has tended to at times encourage too spiritual view of things. I mean, I think a Platonistic view of the soul, for example, a dualistic view of the soul, is not a sustainable option, and in effect not actually a biblical option either. I mean, the most of the writers of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, I think, saw human beings in the famous phrase as animated bodies rather than incarnated souls. So the influence there is variable.
And another, I mean, it's related to the evangelical, is that Cambridge was very important in missionary movements, wasn't it?
Yes, yes, indeed.
In China and all
Yes.
over the world.
Yes. Yes, yes, that's certainly so.
And in this anti-slavery movements.
Well, of
Parks
course,
and
yes, yes. I mean, yes. Yes, I don't know what to say about it. But that's
it's
right.
all true. I've been trying
Yeah.
to characterise, writing a book about Cambridge, trying to characterise the feeling of Cambridge.
Uh-huh.
It's very difficult to capture this feeling of constant reminders of something else, of something numinous or religious in the constant rituals, in the constant observances, the chapel services, and,
Yes.
and the sense of wonder, and yet it's very nebulous, isn't it? It's difficult to pin down, at least I find it difficult to pin down. It reminds me of Japan, which is filled with temples, but when you talk to people, they are a little English evasive about the strength of their religious beliefs.
Well, that can be so. I mean, I must say for myself, I find Christian belief of a fairly orthodox kind. I mean, I can say the Nicene Creed without reservation. Is more persuasive than a rather nebulous thing. I mean, I think that there is a sort of power, explanatory power, and comprehensiveness in a well-articulated Christian theology that a more nebulous spirituality, I think lacks.
Returning to the, these are just sort of
Sure, yeah.
afterthought
Sure.
questions I
Yeah.
like. Returning to the science-religion
Yeah.
controversy, I think you may have said previously that, pointed out that many great scientists were
Yes, certainly.
interested. I mean, do you think actually that in the work of people like Newton onwards, religion actually was some put it another way, Joseph Needham, in trying to understand why Chinese science didn't develop,
Yes.
and others have suggested one of the reasons may be the absence of a firm, principled, or view of that the universe is based on firm principles, and that Taoism and Buddhism doesn't give that, and Christianity, therefore, at a deep level, was necessary for the origins of, or to sustain scientific endeavours. Do you think there's anything in that?
I think there is something in that. I wouldn't want to make it a total explanatory principle, but I think that if you think of the Abrahamic faiths all see the world as having a creator who is rational, and therefore his creation will have an order to it. But a creator is also free to choose the order of the world, and it's not imposed upon him by some world of ideas or something, which provides the blueprints for the demiurge to work with. So that you have to actually look and see what order the creator has chosen to instantiate. And brings together the idea that there is an order in the world, perhaps mathematically discernible, with the fact that you have to also empirically look to see what that order is. Moreover, of course, if you believe the world to be God's creation, then it is worthwhile to explore it. It is worthwhile to read the book of nature, as the 17th century people would say, as well as to read the book of scripture. And I think all these things do combine together, and they do make it are a part of, I'm sure, were helpful, and provide some explanation of why the ancient Greeks, clever though they were, didn't quite get onto it. Pretty near with Archimedes, but not quite. And the Chinese, with their tremendous medieval civilization, didn't get onto it either. I think there is something in that, certainly.
And what about the suggestion that there's a basic difference between a God of the Catholics who interferes through miracles in nature, and therefore natural laws are rather unpredictable and probabilistic at least, whereas in after the Reformation, the Protestant leave God. I mean, he's the first mover, but after that he doesn't interfere, and therefore science might be more likely to develop in Protestant cultures.
Well, that might be so. I mean, I think you neither want endlessly interfering celestial magician at work in the world, nor I think do you want a deistic spectator. I think my picture, supported both by science and theology, is a world of open process, not a clockwork deterministic world at all, but something richer, more subtle, and I believe more supple than that. And I believe that God does act providentially within history, just as we are allowed in a small way to act as agents, bringing about the future. So that was one thing I'd say. The other thing is, the problem of miracle is a problem that, anyway, Orthodox Christian believers like me certainly can't dodge, because the centre of my own belief is the belief that Jesus was raised from the dead of the first Easter day. And the problem of miracle is really the problem, it's not so much a scientific problem, but a theological problem, which is that whatever God does, God is not surely a celestial conjurer. So, capriciously doing today what God didn't think about doing yesterday and won't be bothered to do tomorrow. So there's a question of divine consistency is the problem of miracle. God isn't condemned never to do anything new. That's why we use personal language about God. God is more like Father than force. The force of gravity is always the same. It'll never change. But God is more like a person than like a force. And people can do particular things in particular circumstances, and even totally unprecedented things in unprecedented circumstances. And that's the problem of miracle. And that's why, if you take the Christian view of the nature of Jesus Christ, that he is God living a human life, accepting a true humanity, but living the human life, then the fact that he was raised from the dead of the first Easter day becomes not a random, capricious act, but a fulfilling and testifying act. And that's the problem of miracle. Miracles are not to be trivialized.
A quotation which I gather you like, and I wondered whether you could tell me what it means, from another great physicist, Freeman Dyson. The more I examine the universe and the details of its architecture, the more evidence I find that the universe in some sense must have known we were coming. What does that mean?
Well, I like the quotation because Freeman Dyson is a great physicist, and it's interesting to hear him saying this. What it means is this. We've come to realise, as we've understood the processes of cosmic history, turning the ball of energy into the world we see today, full of rich variety, we've come to understand that though, of course, all that's taken place through a whole sequence of evolutionary processes of one sort or another, nevertheless, its possibility also depended upon the given physical fabric of the world, the basic laws of nature, taking a very particular, very finely tuned form. Only if the laws of nuclear physics lie within very narrow range will it be possible for stars to make carbon, for example, and therefore the possibility of carbon-based life depends upon that. And there are many, many examples of this fine-tuning, the anthropic universe, as people sometimes say, capable of producing creatures of our complexity, is a very particular world indeed, and that's what Freeman Dyson is referring to there. He phrases it in a curious way. I don't know what he means by saying the universe must have known that we were coming. I mean, I think that's a way of avoiding. Freeman has an ambiguous relationship to religious belief, actually. I mean, he would call himself a cultural Christian, but not a fully committed believer. And I think he's just trying to avoid using the word God at that particular stage.
So if you substitute God for the universe, then it would make a little more sense.
I would say that God intended that something like us should be coming.
Another thing which I think is probably a quotation to a certain extent from your work, you say something like, when you turned your collar round, you didn't forego the search for truth, and that the search for truth in science and religion has a cousinly relationship, which is a rather nice way of putting it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I do mean by that that the question of truth, first of all, seems to me as absolutely central to religion as it is to science. Well, I understand truth in a correspondence sense. That's to say that matching our thinking and understanding with the nature of reality. Of course, not a totally adequate, not a totally perfect match, but that's what we're aiming for. And that's as essential to religion as anything else. Religion isn't, in my view, a technique for consolation or getting us through life and that sort of thing. It is concerned with the reality within which we live. So the question of truth is important to religion, and as it is to science. And I think in both parts of the quest for truth, we're seeking truth through motivated belief. Religious belief is not, in my view, based on some unquestionable authority, some guaranteed sacred book or whatever that tells you all the answers. It is the understanding of particular events and persons and experiences which seem to be transparent to a sacred reality. Of course, that has to be looked at carefully and so on. And of course, religion doesn't have the repeatable character that the science does. I mean, science has a secret weapon of experiment, but all forms of personal encounter with reality don't have the power to repeat it. I mean, we don't hear the same piece of music the same way twice, even if we play the same disc. We have a different reaction every time. So that's what I mean. I mean, I really do want to approach my religious belief in that sort of way. I don't want to approach it as submission to unquestionable authority. I don't want to see it as just a hopeful thought. Of course, theology is much more difficult than the science. I mean, we transcend the physical world and the biological world and can put it to the test. God transcends us and can't be put to the test. But it's the same sort of spirit, and I really do mean it when I say I don't think that when I moved essentially from concentrating my intellectual efforts on science to theology, that I changed all that much.
When you said we transcend the physical world and then God transcends us, that sort of links to another quotation which I think you like, from Anthony Kenny, the philosopher's. After all, if there is no God, then God is incalculably the greatest single creation of the human imagination.
Yes, I do like that. I do like that quotation, and I think it's justified. I mean, you get someone like Dawkins who tells you how terribly malign influence belief in God has had, and nobody could deny that belief has been misused, has led to inquisitions, crusades, all sorts of terrible things, which religious people must take responsibility and feel penitent. But equally, I mean, religion has been extraordinarily fruitful in individual human lives, in inspiring art and movements to improve human life. And the abolition of slavery would be a canonical example. And it does seem to me that it's highly suggestive that there is some reality behind. So the influence is so powerful and widespread and fruitful by and large that it seems to me that it's reasonable to think there might be a reality inspiring it.
It just, unfortunately, just reminded me of Montaigne's remark that if triangles were to create a god, he would be three-sided. In other words,
yes.
the Durkheimian view from anthropology, which is that undoubtedly religious phenomena are very complex and very interesting, but the ability to create many different shapes and forms, which we can find from very early civilizations onwards, I mean, it is to be admired, but it's nothing incalculably more complicated than, say, devising a kinship system or a agricultural system or anything else. It's not incalculably more complex.
Well, I'm not so sure about that. I think it is more complex. And of course, obviously, we are going. Human beings are going to have limited imaginative and intellectual resources, and we have to use what we can. I was talking a little bit earlier about using personal language. Well, not because, of course, I believe God's an old man with a beard in the sky, because it seems to me less misleading to think about God in personal terms than it is to think about God in personal terms. And therefore we can't help having some sort of human images. And of course, Christian belief would say that that's not wholly misleading, because there is some analogical relationship between human beings, the image of God in human beings, and the true nature of God. But I don't want to make that an a priori principle. I want to make that a posteriori discovery that there is that connection. We have to use such resources as we have. In physics, we have this wonderful language of mathematics, which seems so perfectly tailored to what we want to do. In almost everything else we try and do, and I think probably quite a lot of biology, and certainly, or I would guess anthropology, we don't have quite such apt resources to use.
Well, another argument that I think you approve of as supporting the evidence of God is the intelligibility of the universe. That is to say that there's no survival fitness in our ability to understand things like quantum mechanics or general relativity or much of science, and yet we can do these things. Do you think that is a strong argument?
I think it's an extraordinarily significant fact about the world that we are able to plummet to its depths. I mean, obviously we've got to understand the everyday world, but the quantum world is quite different, and though there are some unresolved problems about our understanding of it, nevertheless we can make a great deal of sense of it. And I do think that's a very, very striking fact about the world, and I think it's incidentally, I found it talking with non-believing scientific friends, physicist friends anyway, it's one of the things that they are most uneasy about. Well, the fact that the world is deeply intelligible, but also incidentally wonderfully ordered. I mean, not only can we understand it, but we do have this feeling of wonder at the actual order that we discover when we understand it. Does seem a non-trivial fact, as the mathematicians say, about the world in which we live. It seems to be something that it would be rather intellectually lazy to say, well, bit of good luck, and nothing more to say about it. And it is difficult to see what to say about it, other than that it seems to be evidence of some sort of cosmic mind. And people see, of course, there the threat of theism, and it makes them uneasy. But I've personally not encountered a really serious counter suggestion. Of course, if you think that argument is really convincing, it gives you still a very limited notion of God as a great mathematician or something like that. I mean, I think there's a lot more that we would want to know about God, and we can know about God than that. But at least it sort of puts, if you like, the theistic question on the agenda.
Would you think that if we discovered that there were things that we realised that we could not comprehend, this would therefore be some kind of counter-argument to this? I'll give you an example. When I interviewed Martin Rees about whether we would ever, I mean, I put Stephen Hawking's quotation, we are on the edge of understanding the universe and everything, and I asked Martin whether that was true. He said, well, maybe we'll know in one sense, but what's to guarantee that we will understand what we find? It may be beyond our comprehension, whatever these rules and laws are. The first nanosecond of creation is something we as human beings are not equipped with our minds to understand.
Well, it's a possibility, and I mean, nobody knows how to estimate the probability of that possibility, obviously. Nevertheless, I would still think it's very significant that we can understand as much as we can. I mean, I don't want to claim that the human mind has unlimited ability to understand everything, but it is really quite astonishing, the range of our understanding, and I think that in itself is sufficient to put the question on the agenda. As for encountering limits, well, the only way to find that out is to push the boundaries back and see what we find.
Excellent. Well, those were my supplementary questions. Was there anything else that we?
I don't think so. I mean, obviously one can go endlessly talking about myself, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. It's been a very interesting conversation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm very grateful to you for laying it on.
Reciprocally.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.